For most people today, sleep begins in a bed. It feels so ordinary that we rarely question it. Yet for almost all of human history, beds simply did not exist. For tens of thousands of years, humans slept on the ground on leaves, skins, woven grass, or bare earth. The human body learned to rest in a world where the earth itself was the mattress. The bed, which now feels essential, is actually a very recent arrival in the story of our species. If humans lived this way for so long, it raises a quiet question about our past. Why did 90% of human history have no bed? Long before houses had rooms, before wood was shaped into furniture, and long before the idea of a mattress existed, night arrived in a very different world. The human body would grow quiet as darkness spread across the landscape, but there was no bed waiting nearby, no raised frame, no soft layers arranged carefully for comfort. Instead, sleep happened wherever the body happened to be when the light faded. The ground itself was the surface of rest. Soil, sand, dry grass, flattened leaves, animal skins, or bare earth. These were the materials that supported human sleep for almost the entire history of our species. To understand this, it helps to imagine the deep past not as a distant story, but as the normal condition of human life. For roughly 300,000 years, Homo sapiens existed without furniture. Even earlier human ancestors, stretching back more than 2 million years, lived the same way. During that vast span of time, the human body still needed the same biological rhythms it needs today. Muscles grew tired. The brain required cycles of sleep to restore memory and regulate the nervous system. Yet the physical environment surrounding sleep was completely different from the one most people know now. There were no bedrooms separating night from the rest of life. The place where people slept was often the same place where they had gathered food, shared stories, watched the horizon, and tended small fires. As darkness deepened, the activities of the day slowly faded into stillness, and bodies settled close to the ground. This was not a temporary phase of human history. It was the normal state of existence for countless generations. The idea that sleep requires a special object, a bed, is a very recent thought in comparison. In prehistoric environments, the landscape itself shaped where and how rest happened. Groups moving through grasslands or forests often chose slightly elevated ground to avoid moisture. A patch of earth might be cleared of stones or insects. Dry plant material could be gathered into a thin layer to soften the surface. None of this created anything resembling a modern bed, yet these simple arrangements were enough for the body to rest. The human body adapted to these conditions gradually over immense stretches of time. Bones developed under the influence of constant movement during the day and firm surfaces at night. The spine, which modern people often associate with soft support, evolved in a world where sleep rarely involved thick padding. Even the patterns of how people arranged themselves at night were shaped by the absence of furniture. Without beds separating individuals, people often slept close together, sharing warmth and safety in the darkness. This closeness reflected the realities of prehistoric life. The night world contained predators, sudden temperature changes, and unfamiliar sounds beyond the reach of firelight. Resting together reduced risk and created a small circle of security. When archaeologists search for evidence of these early sleeping places, they rarely find dramatic structures. Instead, they look for subtle traces, compressed plant layers, microscopic fragments of grass, ash from nearby fires, or patterns of repeated occupation on ancient ground surfaces. These faint signs remind us that for most of human history, sleep left very little behind except the quiet impression of bodies resting on the earth. The absence of beds was not unusual to the people living then. It was simply the way human life worked. The ground was not considered primitive or uncomfortable. It was familiar. It was dependable. And for thousands upon thousands of generations, it was where the human body returned each night as darkness slowly covered the world. Night in the prehistoric world arrived without clear boundaries. There were no walls to close, no doors to lock, and no room designed only for sleeping. The fading of daylight itself was the signal that the human body would soon need rest. As the sun dropped below the horizon, temperatures shifted, animals changed their behavior, and the landscape slowly entered a different rhythm. Early humans moved within this rhythm rather than separating themselves from it. When the time for sleep approached, they did not walk toward a bed waiting in a fixed place. Instead, they prepared the ground around them in small, practical ways that reflected the environment they were living in. A patch of earth might be cleared with hands or simple tools to remove sharp stones. Dry grasses could be gathered and spread into a thin layer. In some regions, broad leaves or soft plant stems created a slightly cushioned surface. In colder places, animal skins from previous hunts sometimes formed a barrier between the body and the cold soil. None of these arrangements were permanent. They were temporary adjustments made for a single night or for a short stay in one location. This temporary nature reflected how human groups lived for most of their history. For hundreds of thousands of years, people were highly mobile. Food sources shifted with the seasons, animals migrated across large territories, and water could appear or disappear depending on climate. Because of this constant movement, the places where people slept also changed frequently. A sleeping area might be used for several nights, or sometimes only once, before the group moved on again. The absence of beds was not a sign of hardship in the way modern observers might imagine. It was simply the natural result of living in a world where mobility was essential. Carrying heavy furniture across grasslands or forests would have made little sense in a life organized around movement. Instead, the sleeping place was created anew wherever the group stopped for the night. Over long stretches of time, the human body grew accustomed to these conditions. Sleep happened on firm ground more often than on soft surfaces. The spine rested without the thick cushioning that modern mattresses provide. Muscles relaxed while the body was supported by the earth itself rather than by constructed furniture. This does not mean that prehistoric sleep was uncomfortable. The body tends to adapt to the environments it experiences repeatedly. When the ground is the normal surface of rest across many generations, it becomes familiar rather than unusual. In many parts of the world today, communities still sleep on firm mats or thin layers placed directly on the floor. Anthropologists observing these cultures often notice that the body adapts easily when the practice begins early in life. Such observations offer a small window into how sleep may have felt for most of human history. Archaeological discoveries help confirm that early humans did take care in preparing places to rest, even without building beds. In a cave in South Africa known as Sibudu Cave, researchers found layers of ancient plant material that appear to have been arranged intentionally as sleeping surfaces more than 70,000 years ago. These layers contained grasses and leaves placed together in ways that suggest repeated human use. The plants may have served not only to soften the ground but also to repel insects, since some species naturally release chemicals that discourage pests. Findings like this reveal something important about early human life. Even without furniture, people were not careless about sleep. They shaped their immediate environment in small ways that made rest safer and more comfortable. These quiet adjustments, clearing the ground, spreading plants, choosing protected locations, formed the earliest human strategies for sleeping. The concept of a bed, a permanent object designed only for rest, would come much later. For the vast majority of human history, sleep remained closely tied to the natural surfaces of the earth, created each night from whatever the surrounding landscape could provide. As night settled over the prehistoric landscape, the act of sleeping was rarely something an individual did alone. The absence of beds meant that the boundary between one sleeper and another was often very small. Instead of separate sleeping spaces, human groups tended to rest together on the same prepared patch of ground. Bodies formed loose circles or clusters, sometimes arranged around a small fire that continued to glow through the darkness. This shared pattern of sleep reflected the conditions in which early humans lived. The world beyond the firelight contained animals that hunted at night, sudden changes in temperature, and unfamiliar sounds that could travel across open land. Sleeping close together helped reduce some of these dangers. If one person woke to a distant movement or an unusual noise, the rest of the group could become alert as well. In this way, the structure of sleep itself became part of the survival strategy of early human communities. Over long periods of time, this shared sleeping pattern shaped how the human body and mind experienced the night. The brain did not rely on total isolation or silence to fall asleep. Instead, it adapted to a softer background of human presence, breathing, small movements, quiet voices fading as fatigue settled over the group. Anthropologists who study modern hunter-gatherer societies have observed similar patterns. In communities that still live with minimal furniture and flexible sleeping arrangements, People often fall asleep in shared spaces where several individuals rest within a short distance of one another. These observations do not provide a perfect picture of the deep past, but they suggest that communal sleeping may have been common throughout much of human history. The ground itself played an important role in this nightly arrangement. Because there were no raised beds separating bodies from the earth, temperature moved easily between the surface and the people resting on it. In warm climates, the soil could slowly release heat gathered during the day, creating a stable surface for sleep after sunset. In cooler environments, plant layers or animal skins helped slow the loss of body warmth to the ground. These simple materials formed a thin but meaningful barrier that made rest possible even in changing conditions. Over generations, humans learned to choose sleeping locations carefully. Slightly elevated areas reduced the chance of water collecting during rain. Sheltered spaces near rock formations or inside shallow caves could block wind. Vegetation nearby provided materials that could be gathered quickly to create a thin layer between the body and the soil. None of these decisions created permanent sleeping structures, yet they reveal how attentive early humans were to the environment surrounding their rest. Archaeological sites sometimes preserve faint traces of these repeated choices. Layers of compacted earth, scattered plant fragments, and small clusters of ash from nearby fires suggest places where groups returned again and again to spend the night. These traces are quiet, almost invisible compared to the buildings and furniture that appear later in history. Yet, they represent the normal pattern of human sleep for an immense span of time. When viewed across the full timeline of our species, the modern idea of a bed begins to look unusual rather than essential. For thousands of generations, the human body ended each day by settling onto the ground within a small circle of other people, protected by firelight and the surrounding landscape. Sleep did not belong to a piece of furniture or to a private room. It belonged to the earth itself, to the shared presence of the group, and to the natural rhythm that guided human life long before the invention of beds. The place where humans slept was rarely chosen at random. Long before houses existed, early people learned that the landscape itself could shape the quality and safety of sleep. A small difference in terrain could mean the difference between a calm night and an uncomfortable one. Slightly raised ground kept bodies above damp soil after rain. Areas with short grass or loose earth were easier to clear of insects and stones. Nearby trees could soften the wind while still allowing enough open space to watch the surroundings. Over many generations, humans developed a quiet knowledge of how to recognize these places. It was not written down or taught in formal ways, but it was repeated through experience every evening as daylight faded. When groups moved across open plains, the search for a sleeping place often began before darkness fully arrived. People paid attention to the direction of the wind, the presence of animals, and the materials available nearby. Dry grasses, leaves, or small branches could quickly become the thin layer that separated the body from the ground. Even a few centimeters of plant material could soften the firmness of the earth and create a surface that held warmth through the night. These small preparations did not transform the ground into a bed, yet they helped the body relax enough for sleep to begin. Archaeological discoveries suggest that this practice has very deep roots. At sites where early humans lived tens of thousands of years ago, researchers sometimes find clusters of plant remains arranged in ways that appear deliberate rather than accidental. One well-known example comes from Sibudu Cave in South Africa, where layers of grasses and leaves were found stacked together in thin surfaces that resemble ancient sleeping mats. Some of these plant layers date back roughly 70 to 80,000 years. The plants appear to have been selected intentionally, and in certain layers scientists detected traces of species that naturally repel insects. This suggests that early humans were not only placing vegetation beneath their bodies for comfort, but may also have been choosing plants that helped reduce bites from pests during the night. Such discoveries reveal something important about how humans approach sleep long before the existence of beds. The act of resting was shaped by the surrounding environment rather than by constructed furniture. Each sleeping place was temporary, built from whatever the landscape provided in that moment. When a group moved to a new location, the entire process began again. This repeated cycle created a strong connection between human rest and the natural world. The ground was not simply a surface beneath the body. It was part of the system that made sleep possible. The human body itself reflects this long relationship with natural sleeping environments. Muscles relax most easily when the body can distribute weight evenly across a stable surface. Firm ground offers this stability in a different way than modern mattresses do. Instead of sinking deeply into soft material, the body settles gradually as joints and muscles adjust to the shape of the earth beneath them. Over thousands of years, this pattern became the ordinary way humans rested at night. The absence of beds did not mean that people slept without preparation or care. Rather, it meant that the preparation happened directly within the environment. Leaves, grasses, and animal skins formed simple layers that disappeared quickly after people moved on. The next evening, the landscape would again provide the materials needed for sleep. In this way, early humans lived in a constant cycle of movement and rest, where every night required creating a new sleeping place from the ground itself. The landscapes where early humans slept were not always caves or sheltered places. For much of human history, people rested in open environments where the sky remained visible above them. Grasslands, riverbanks, forest clearings, and dry savannas formed the nightly setting for countless generations. These places offered different advantages depending on the season and the region. Open ground allowed people to see approaching animals more easily. Breezes could reduce insects during warm nights. In cooler climates, groups sometimes chose areas near rock formations or shallow overhangs where wind was weaker. The decision about where to sleep was often shaped by the same awareness that guided hunting and gathering during the day. Humans learned to read the landscape carefully, noticing patterns that repeated over time. Some areas collected water after rain and were avoided. Others were visited frequently by animals that moved through the region at night. A quiet place to rest was usually somewhere slightly removed from these paths. Even small details could influence the choice of a sleeping area. A patch of ground where vegetation had been flattened earlier might suggest a place that had already been used before. The presence of dry plant material nearby meant that a thin surface layer could be prepared quickly before darkness fully settled in. In regions with tall grasses, people sometimes cut or gathered stalks to form a loose bedding layer only a few centimeters thick. This layer helped separate the body from insects in the soil and created a slightly warmer surface as night temperatures dropped. In forested regions, broad leaves and small branches could serve the same purpose. These materials were not permanent constructions. They were temporary arrangements shaped by whatever plants were available within walking distance. When archaeologists study ancient human campsites, they often find very little evidence of these sleeping places because natural materials decay quickly. Grass and leaves disappear over time, leaving only faint traces in the soil. Yet in rare conditions where preservation is possible, the pattern becomes clearer. Layers of plant fragments sometimes appear concentrated in small areas where people repeatedly rested. At a few prehistoric sites, these layers show signs of being replaced regularly, suggesting that new vegetation was gathered after older material became worn or compacted. This simple behavior reflects an early form of environmental adaptation. Humans were not building furniture, but they were shaping their sleeping environment in small, practical ways. The process required little effort, yet improved the quality of rest each night. The connection between sleep and the surrounding landscape also influenced how groups organized themselves in space. When several individuals slept together on the same prepared ground, the arrangement of bodies often followed subtle patterns. Elders or children might rest closer to the center of the group where warmth and safety were greatest. Others positioned themselves along the edges where they could remain aware of sounds beyond the sleeping circle. These arrangements were not fixed rules but flexible responses to the environment. The presence of fire sometimes shaped these patterns as well. A small fire could provide light and warmth during the early hours of the night. As the flames settled into glowing embers, the surrounding ground retained some of that warmth, making nearby sleeping places more comfortable. Over thousands of years, the nightly process of choosing ground, gathering plant material, and arranging bodies within the group became an ordinary rhythm of human life. Sleep did not belong to a special object or location. It emerged from the interaction between people, the earth beneath them, and the quiet knowledge of how to rest safely within the natural world. As the night deepened across prehistoric landscapes, the ground beneath sleeping humans carried more meaning than it might seem at first. It was not only a surface where the body rested, it also formed part of a quiet relationship between human life and the environment that surrounded it. Early humans learned through repeated experience that the earth itself behaved differently in different places. Soil that held moisture too easily could become cold and uncomfortable during the night. Sandy ground drained water more quickly but might shift under the weight of the body. Hard-packed earth offered stability, while thick vegetation sometimes hid insects or small animals. Over many generations, people became familiar with these differences. Choosing where to sleep was therefore a small but important decision made almost every evening. The human body adapted gradually to these nightly conditions. Resting on the ground meant that weight was distributed across wider areas of the body rather than concentrated in soft padding. When lying on a firm surface, the shoulders, hips, and back settled naturally into stable contact with the earth. Muscles slowly released tension as the body adjusted its position. This process did not depend on thick layers of cushioning. Instead, it relied on the body's ability to shift slightly until a balanced position was found. In environments where thin plant layers were added beneath the body, those materials provided just enough softness to reduce pressure from stones or uneven soil, while still maintaining the firmness of the ground. Anthropological studies of modern communities that sleep on mats or thin surfaces suggest that the body often adapts comfortably to these conditions when they are part of daily life. The absence of beds in early human history was therefore not simply a missing piece of technology. It reflected the broader structure of human life at the time. Groups moved frequently, carrying only what could be transported easily. Tools were simple and practical. Most objects served multiple purposes. A permanent sleeping structure would have required materials, time, and energy that were difficult to maintain while living in a constantly changing landscape. Instead, the sleeping place remained flexible and temporary, shaped each night from what was immediately available. Archaeological evidence occasionally preserves hints of how these sleeping places were used repeatedly. At certain prehistoric sites, researchers have identified areas where plant material appears layered in thin sequences, suggesting that people return to the same location across multiple visits. Over time, old vegetation compressed into the soil while new material was placed above it. These patterns indicate that although early humans moved often, some sleeping areas were favored and reused when groups passed through the region again. The ground slowly recorded these visits in subtle layers that archaeologists can still detect thousands of years later. These faint traces remind us how ordinary ground-based sleep once was. For countless generations, human life ended each day with the body settling onto the earth itself. The same ground that supported walking, gathering, and building fires during the day became the surface for rest at night. There was no separation between the landscape of daily activity and the place where sleep occurred. Only much later in history would humans begin creating objects designed specifically for sleeping. When that change eventually appeared, it transformed the physical setting of sleep in profound ways. But before those inventions arrived, the earth remained the original surface of human rest, shaping how people slept across nearly all of human history. For most of human history, the human body experienced sleep in direct contact with the earth. This long relationship between the body and the ground shaped subtle aspects of how people rested at night. When the sun disappeared and temperatures began to fall, the ground slowly released the heat it had absorbed during the day. In many regions, especially open grasslands or dry savannas where early humans often lived, the surface of the earth remained slightly warmer than the air during the early hours of darkness. Resting on this surface allowed the body to conserve warmth more easily than if it were exposed to moving air. Over many thousands of years, humans became familiar with these patterns without needing to explain them scientifically. The ground simply felt like the natural place to lie down when the day ended. The structure of the human body also interacts with firm surfaces in particular ways. When a person lies on solid ground, the body's weight spreads gradually across the back, shoulders, and hips. The spine settles into a neutral position supported by the surrounding muscles and connective tissues. Unlike modern mattresses that compress under weight, firm earth changes very little beneath the body. This stability means that the body itself adjusts to find balance, rather than relying on a soft surface to shape around it. Early humans would have experienced this kind of contact every night for generation after generation. Over such immense spans of time, sleeping on firm surfaces became the normal physical condition of rest. Evidence from modern research helps illuminate how the body responds to these conditions. Studies of populations that sleep on mats or thin surfaces show that the body often shifts positions throughout the night, redistributing pressure across different areas. These movements are usually small and gradual. Rather than sinking deeply into a soft mattress, the sleeper makes slight adjustments that allow muscles and joints to remain comfortable. Anthropologists observing traditional societies have noticed that these subtle shifts are common during sleep and rarely disturb rest. The body simply adapts to the surface beneath it. This adaptation is part of a broader pattern of human flexibility. Throughout evolutionary history, humans have lived in a wide variety of environments. Sleep has always been necessary, but the physical setting of sleep has changed depending on the landscape. In forest regions, thick layers of leaves sometimes provided softer ground. In dry areas, sandy soil offered a surface that could shift slightly to accommodate the body. In colder climates, animal skins or additional plant layers helped create insulation between the sleeper and the earth. Each of these variations represented small adjustments within the same basic pattern: sleep occurring directly on the ground. Archaeological evidence occasionally preserves signs of how early humans organized these sleeping places. At some sites, thin layers of vegetation appear beneath areas where people likely rested repeatedly. These layers suggest that people understood the value of placing plant material between the body and the soil. The plants created a slight barrier that reduced moisture, softened uneven ground, and sometimes discouraged insects. Even without constructing beds, early humans were shaping their sleeping environment through careful choices. The absence of furniture did not mean the absence of thought or preparation. It simply meant that the solutions remained simple and temporary, formed from the natural materials available in the surrounding landscape. Over thousands of generations, this pattern continued with remarkable consistency. The human body ended the day by lowering itself to the earth, surrounded by the sounds of the natural world and the quiet presence of others nearby. In this setting, the ground was not seen as primitive or uncomfortable. It was the surface on which human sleep had always happened. Only much later would the idea emerge that sleep required a raised structure separating the body from the earth. Before that shift occurred, the ground itself remained the original foundation of human rest. The relationship between the human body and the ground did not develop in a single generation. It emerged slowly across immense stretches of evolutionary time. Long before modern humans appeared, earlier members of the human lineage were already resting on natural surfaces. Species such as Homo erectus, who lived nearly 2 million years ago, likely slept on the ground or on simple layers of vegetation much like later humans did. Their bodies carried many of the structural features that modern people still possess today: a flexible spine, broad shoulders, and hips designed for long periods of upright walking during the day. When night arrived, those same anatomical features had to support rest on firm surfaces. Over time, this repeated pattern of movement by day and grounded sleep by night became a consistent rhythm shaping the human body. One of the most noticeable characteristics of the human skeleton is the shape of the spine. The spine forms a gentle series of curves that help distribute weight and maintain balance when standing or walking. When a person lies down on a firm surface, these curves settle naturally into a stable position supported by surrounding muscles and ligaments. The body does not remain perfectly still throughout the night. Instead, it shifts position occasionally, redistributing pressure across different areas. These small movements help maintain circulation and prevent discomfort from building in any single part of the body. In an environment where sleep happens directly on the ground, these adjustments become a natural part of the sleeping process. Over thousands of generations, the body becomes familiar with this pattern. It learns to rest through subtle changes in posture, rather than relying on deep cushioning beneath it. Anthropological observations of traditional societies provide insight into how this process still works today. In many communities where people sleep on woven mats or thin bedding placed on the floor, sleepers often change positions quietly during the night. The transitions are gradual and usually do not disturb the surrounding sleepers. The body simply responds to pressure points by shifting slightly, allowing muscles and joints to relax again. These movements occur without conscious effort. They are part of the body's automatic regulation during sleep. Such patterns suggest that the human body is capable of resting effectively on relatively firm surfaces when those conditions are familiar. Another important factor in this long relationship between the body and the ground is temperature regulation. The human body produces heat continuously, even during sleep. When resting on natural surfaces, some of that heat transfers slowly into the ground beneath. Thin layers of plant material, leaves, or animal skins helped reduce this heat loss by creating a small insulating barrier. Archaeological evidence suggests that early humans sometimes selected particular plant species for sleeping areas, possibly because certain leaves were thicker or more resistant to insects. These choices reflect a practical understanding of how the environment affected comfort and safety during rest. Over time, such small decisions accumulated into shared knowledge within human groups. Each generation learned from experience which materials worked best beneath the body and which locations were most suitable for sleeping. The absence of beds did not mean the absence of structure in human sleep. Instead, the structure came from the interaction between the body and the surrounding environment. Ground firmness, plant layers, temperature, and group arrangement all influenced how rest unfolded during the night. For nearly the entire span of human history, this relationship remained remarkably stable. The body adjusted to the earth, and the earth provided the surface on which sleep could happen. Only in the relatively recent past did humans begin to introduce permanent objects designed to separate the body from the ground. When that shift began, it gradually changed the physical experience of sleep. But before those changes appeared, the human body had already spent hundreds of thousands of years learning how to rest directly upon the earth. Across the immense span of human history, the body's nightly contact with the ground shaped not only posture, but also the way rest unfolded through time. Sleep was not always a single, uninterrupted block as many people imagine today. In natural environments where artificial light did not exist, the rhythm of night followed the slow movement of darkness and temperature. Early humans experienced this rhythm directly. After the final light of sunset faded and the group settled near their chosen resting place, the body gradually entered the first period of sleep. This early phase often occurred while the warmth of the day still lingered in the soil beneath them. The ground, having absorbed sunlight throughout the afternoon, released that heat slowly into the surrounding air and into the bodies resting upon it. This gentle exchange helped create a stable temperature during the first hours of rest. As the night progressed and the earth cooled, people sometimes shifted their positions or adjusted the materials beneath them. Small movements were common, turning from one side to another, drawing knees closer to conserve warmth, or pulling plant layers and skins more tightly around the body. These adjustments happened quietly within the sleeping group and rarely required anyone to leave the ground. Over generations, the human body became accustomed to these gradual changes in the sleeping environment. Rest was not dependent on maintaining a perfectly constant surface or temperature. Instead, it unfolded through subtle adaptations as the night evolved. Evidence from historical observations and studies of traditional societies suggests that people living without artificial lighting often experience sleep in phases separated by short periods of wakefulness. During these quiet intervals, individuals might shift their position, add material beneath their bodies, or simply rest in stillness before sleep returned again. When sleep happens directly on the ground within a shared space, these natural pauses fit easily into the rhythm of the night. The body remains close to the environment, responding to changes in temperature, sound, and light, without fully separating from them. Archaeological findings offer indirect clues about how these sleeping environments were maintained. At certain ancient sites, thin layers of plant material appear stacked one above another, suggesting that older bedding surfaces were gradually replaced. Over time, compressed layers remained in the soil while new grasses or leaves were added above them. These layers indicate that people recognized when a sleeping surface had become worn or compacted and responded by refreshing the material beneath their bodies. Such actions were simple but meaningful, showing that early humans actively maintained the quality of their resting places even without constructing permanent beds. This long relationship between the human body and the ground shaped a quiet familiarity with the earth itself. The surface beneath the body was not viewed as primitive or temporary. It was simply where rest occurred. The same ground that carried footsteps during the day became the support for sleep at night. Firelight flickered nearby. Insects moved through the grass, and distant animals called across the darkness. Yet the body remained close to the earth throughout it all. Only much later in human history would people begin raising their sleeping surfaces above the ground, introducing objects designed specifically for rest. Before that transformation began, countless generations of humans ended each day in the same way, by lowering themselves gently onto the earth and allowing sleep to arrive as the night slowly unfolded around them. The deeper scientists look into the distant past, the more difficult it becomes to find clear traces of something as quiet as sleep. Tools made of stone can survive for hundreds of thousands of years. Bones may remain buried in the soil long after the people who used them are gone, but the places where humans once rested are far more delicate. Grass, leaves, and other natural materials decay quickly. Rain, wind, and shifting soil gradually erase the faint impressions left by sleeping bodies. Because of this, the archaeology of ancient sleep often depends on subtle evidence rather than dramatic discoveries. Researchers must look carefully for small patterns in the ground that suggest repeated human activity in a particular place. Sometimes these patterns appear as thin layers of plant material compressed into the soil. At other times they appear as clusters of ash, fragments of charcoal, or the scattered remains of insects that lived within bedding plants. One of the most important discoveries connected to early human sleeping places comes from Sibudu Cave in present-day South Africa. Within the cave's deep sediment layers, archaeologists uncovered repeated surfaces made from grasses and other plant materials arranged in thin bedding layers. Some of these layers date back roughly 70 to 80,000 years. The plants were not randomly scattered across the ground. Instead, they appeared concentrated in particular zones where humans likely rested. Careful analysis showed that certain plant species had been selected deliberately. Some of these plants contain natural chemical compounds that help repel insects. Their presence suggests that early humans may have understood, through experience, which plants made sleeping areas more comfortable by discouraging pests. This finding offers a rare glimpse into the thoughtful decisions that shaped prehistoric sleep. Even without beds or furniture, humans were actively modifying the ground beneath them. They gathered specific plants, placed them in layers, and replaced them when the material became worn or compacted. Over time, these actions created subtle bedding surfaces that left faint archaeological traces. Other sites around the world provide similar hints. In some caves and rock shelters, researchers have found flattened zones where repeated human occupation gradually compressed the soil. Nearby, small clusters of ash from ancient fires appear again and again in roughly the same positions. These patterns suggest that sleeping places were often arranged near firelight, where warmth and protection were available during the night. Although the materials themselves rarely survive intact, the organization of these spaces helps archaeologists imagine how early humans structured their resting environments. These discoveries reveal something important about the long period of human history before beds existed. The absence of furniture did not mean that sleep was left entirely to chance. People paid attention to the quality of the ground, the plants beneath their bodies, and the safety of the surrounding environment. Small improvements, adding fresh grasses, clearing insects, positioning near warmth made a noticeable difference in how comfortably the body could rest through the night. Over thousands of years, these practical adjustments became part of the shared knowledge passed through generations. The ground itself remained the central surface of sleep, but humans learned how to shape it gently with the materials around them. Archaeology rarely captures the full detail of these quiet nightly routines. Most of the evidence has long since disappeared. Yet the fragments that remain reveal a consistent pattern stretching far back into human history. People sleeping close to the earth, arranging simple layers beneath their bodies, and returning to familiar resting places when the landscape allowed it. Long before beds appeared as permanent objects, these humble plant layers formed the earliest foundations of human sleep. Archaeologists rarely uncover clear evidence of ancient sleep because the materials involved were fragile and temporary. Leaves, grasses, and soft plant stems break down quickly once they are exposed to moisture, insects, and the slow movement of soil over time. For this reason, many sleeping places used by early humans have completely disappeared from the archaeological record. Yet in a few locations where conditions protected organic material, scientists have been able to reconstruct surprising details about how prehistoric people prepared the ground for rest. These discoveries suggest that the act of sleeping was not simply a passive collapse onto the earth at the end of the day. Instead, it often involved small but deliberate actions that improved comfort and safety through the night. In addition to the plant bedding discovered in southern Africa, similar patterns appear in other prehistoric sites where humans lived repeatedly over long periods. At some cave sites, thin layers of vegetation appear interwoven with ash from ancient fires. These layers show signs of being replaced periodically, suggesting that people recognized when the plant materials beneath them had become compressed or worn down. Fresh vegetation would then be gathered and placed on top, creating a renewed sleeping surface. Over time, this process produced a sequence of faint bedding layers preserved in the soil. Each layer represents a moment in the distant past when someone prepared a place to lie down and rest. These archaeological traces are subtle, yet they reveal a remarkable continuity in human behavior. Early humans were not building beds in the modern sense, but they were already thinking about how the ground beneath them affected sleep. A surface covered with dry plants provided insulation from cold soil. It also helped keep the body above small insects or moisture that might collect on bare ground. Certain plants may have been chosen because their scent or chemical properties discouraged pests. Scientists studying preserved plant fragments sometimes identify species known today for these natural qualities. This suggests that early humans learned through experience which plants made the most comfortable sleeping surfaces. The repeated appearance of plant bedding near ancient hearths also provides clues about how sleeping areas were organized. Fire served many purposes in early human life. It produced warmth, extended light into the evening hours, and helped deter animals that avoided flames. When people arranged bedding materials near a hearth, they created a small zone where warmth and safety could persist during the first part of the night. As the fire slowly burned down to embers, the ground nearby retained some of that heat. This subtle warming of the earth may have made those sleeping spots especially desirable. The pattern appears again and again in archaeological sites, where traces of plant bedding are found close to areas used for fire. Such arrangements suggest that sleeping places were not scattered randomly across the landscape. Instead, they were carefully positioned within the small living spaces humans created each evening. These spaces often included areas for food preparation, tool use, and resting. Sleep was woven quietly into this daily environment rather than separated from it. The more archaeologists study these ancient sites, the clearer it becomes that the absence of beds did not mean the absence of thoughtful preparation. Early humans were attentive to the ground, the plants they used, and the warmth of nearby fire. Their sleeping places were simple, yet they reflected a deep familiarity with the natural materials surrounding them. Across tens of thousands of years, these small adjustments shaped the nightly experience of human rest. The earth remained the foundation of sleep, but people learned how to soften, insulate, and maintain that surface with the resources available in their environment. When archaeologists examine the distant past, they often rely on fragments that survive by chance. A stone tool may remain where it was dropped. A bone might be preserved beneath layers of soil. But the quiet places where humans once slept rarely leave strong marks on the landscape. For this reason, each discovery connected to ancient sleeping surfaces becomes especially valuable. These findings help scientists piece together how people organized their nights long before beds existed. In several prehistoric sites around the world, researchers have identified subtle zones where human activity appears to have repeated across many generations. These zones often contain thin layers of plant material, traces of ash from fires, and compacted soil where bodies may have rested repeatedly. Although these traces are delicate, together they form a pattern that suggests how early humans structured their living spaces. The sleeping place was usually not far from the center of activity where fire burned and tools were used during the evening. This arrangement allowed the warmth of the fire to reach those resting nearby, while also keeping the group within a shared space of light and protection. One striking aspect of these archaeological discoveries is the consistency that appears across different regions. Whether in African caves, Mediterranean rock shelters, or other prehistoric sites, the evidence often points to the same basic strategy. Humans preparing simple plant layers on the ground in areas close to hearths. This repeated pattern suggests that the idea of improving the ground for sleep may have been widespread among early human groups. It did not require complex tools or permanent structures. The materials needed grasses, leaves, small branches were usually available within a short distance of the sleeping place. Gathering them required only a small effort at the end of the day, yet the result could make the difference between a cold surface and a slightly insulated one. Archaeologists also pay attention to the microscopic remains found within these ancient bedding layers. Tiny fragments of plant tissue, pollen grains, and even the remains of insects sometimes survive in protected sediments. By studying these microscopic clues, scientists can identify which plants were used and whether they were likely gathered intentionally. In certain cases, the plant species discovered are known to contain natural compounds that repel insects or release aromatic oils when crushed. This suggests that early humans may have selected these plants deliberately after noticing that they improved the sleeping environment. Such knowledge would not have required scientific explanations. It could simply have been learned through repeated experience over many generations. Each small observation, such as fewer insect bites after sleeping on a particular plant, could gradually shape the choices people made when preparing the ground for rest. The archaeological record therefore reveals something subtle but important. Even in a world without beds, early humans were already experimenting with ways to improve sleep. They gathered plants, replaced worn bedding layers, and positioned sleeping areas near sources of warmth and protection. These practices show that the need for comfortable rest has deep roots in human history. The difference lies in how that comfort was created. Instead of building raised structures, people shaped the earth itself into a temporary resting place using the materials available around them. For tens of thousands of years, this quiet routine repeated itself across landscapes where humans lived. Each evening ended with the same simple act, preparing a small patch of ground where the body could lie down and allow sleep to arrive. Long before the invention of beds, one element quietly reshaped how humans experienced the night: fire. The ability to control fire did not simply change how food was prepared or how warmth was maintained during cold seasons. It also transformed the structure of nighttime itself. Before fire became a regular part of human life, darkness limited activity and reduced visibility. The ground where people rested remained fully exposed to the sounds and movements of the surrounding landscape. But once early humans began to gather around controlled flames, the night acquired a small center of light and warmth. This change altered where people chose to sleep and how they arranged themselves on the ground. Archaeological evidence suggests that regular use of fire became common among human ancestors at least several 100,000 years ago. Sites associated with Homo erectus and later species show repeated traces of hearths, areas where fire was contained and maintained. These hearths often appear in the same locations where signs of human occupation accumulate. Ash, charcoal, and burned bone fragments mark places where flames once burned long after the fire itself disappeared. Around these hearths, the ground sometimes shows subtle evidence of repeated human presence, suggesting that people not only used these areas for cooking or warmth, but also spent long evenings nearby before resting for the night. The presence of fire changed the practical decisions involved in choosing a sleeping place. A small fire could deter certain animals that avoided bright flames and human activity. The warmth from the embers spread slowly across the nearby ground, making the surrounding surface more comfortable as night temperatures dropped. Even after visible flames faded, the soil and stones near the hearth retained heat for hours. This made the ground around the fire one of the most favorable places to lie down. Over time, early humans appear to have organized their sleeping areas in relation to these hearths. Instead of scattered individuals resting randomly across the landscape, groups often formed loose circles around the fire. The hearth became the quiet center of a shared space where conversation, tool repair, and food preparation could continue into the evening. As fatigue gradually replaced activity, people simply settled onto the ground nearby. The sleeping place did not need to be separate from the living space. It emerged naturally from the same area where the group had gathered throughout the evening. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer societies sometimes observe similar arrangements. In many cases, the evening fire becomes the social center of the camp. As the night grows quieter, people position themselves near the warmth of the embers before sleep begins. These observations provide a glimpse of how ancient human groups may have organized their nights long before permanent beds existed. The circle of people resting around a fading fire would have created a shared zone of warmth and awareness. If someone stirred or awoke during the night, the movement could be noticed easily by others nearby. This shared arrangement may have added an extra layer of security in environments where nighttime dangers were real. Fire therefore played a quiet but important role in shaping human sleep. It did not create beds, but it changed the environment in which people rested. The ground near a hearth became warmer, brighter, and more protected than the surrounding darkness. Over thousands of generations, these small advantages likely influence where and how humans lay down at the end of the day. In this way, the simple presence of fire began to shape the nightly landscape of human rest long before any raised sleeping structures appeared. As evening settled across prehistoric camps, The fire at the center of the group did more than provide warmth. It quietly organized the space where humans spent the night. Without walls, furniture, or fixed sleeping areas, the arrangement of people on the ground followed the presence of the flame. The fire created a small island of light within the surrounding darkness. Beyond its glow, the landscape quickly faded into shadow where animals moved and unfamiliar sounds carried across the night air. For early humans, remaining close to this circle of light offered a practical sense of safety. As a result, the place where people eventually slept was often shaped by the fading warmth of the hearth. During the evening hours, human activity usually gathered around this same central point. Food might be roasted over the fire. Tools could be repaired or sharpened in the remaining daylight and firelight. Conversations continued as the sky darkened and the stars appeared overhead. These moments gradually slowed as fatigue set in. Instead of leaving this shared space to search for separate sleeping areas, people simply settled nearby when the time for rest arrived. The ground around the hearth, therefore, became a natural sleeping zone, not because it was designed that way, but because it was already the place where the group had gathered together. Archaeological sites sometimes preserve traces of this pattern. In several ancient campsites, scientists have found hearth remains surrounded by areas where plant bedding or repeated human activity appears to have occurred. These areas often form loose rings or clusters around the fire. Although the exact positions of individual sleepers cannot be reconstructed with certainty, the pattern suggests that people rested within the same space where evening life unfolded. The hearth acted as a quiet anchor point, shaping the way bodies were distributed across the ground during the night. The warmth of the fire also influenced these arrangements in practical ways. Even after flames died down, the embers and heated stones retained warmth for hours. The earth surrounding the hearth absorbed some of this heat, creating a slightly warmer surface compared with more distant ground. During cooler nights, sleeping close to this warmth could make a noticeable difference. People resting near the center of the group likely experienced more stable temperatures, while those farther away remained more exposed to cold air and wind. These small variations may have influenced how individuals positioned themselves within the sleeping circle. Children, elders, or individuals needing additional warmth might remain closer to the center, while others settled along the outer edges of the group. This arrangement also had advantages beyond warmth. When several people rested together in a shared space, awareness of the surroundings increased. If an unusual sound occurred in the darkness, someone near the edge of the group might wake first and alert the others. The sleeping circle around the fire therefore created a form of collective security without requiring permanent structures. Each person's presence contributed to the safety of the group during the night. Anthropologists studying present-day hunter-gatherer societies have documented similar sleeping arrangements in camps where fires remain central to evening life. In many cases, individuals rest within view of the embers rather than moving to separate sleeping quarters. These patterns offer insight into how ancient humans may have experienced nighttime before the invention of beds. The ground near the hearth served multiple purposes: a place for gathering, warmth, conversation, and eventually sleep. Over countless generations, this quiet structure repeated itself again and again. Firelight faded, bodies settled onto the earth, and the sleeping circle formed naturally around the last glowing embers of the night. As the fire slowly faded into embers, the space around it became quieter. The sounds of conversation disappeared first, replaced by the softer rhythms of breathing and occasional movement as people adjusted their positions on the ground. In these moments, the hearth continued to shape the sleeping environment even without visible flames. The stones and soil that had absorbed heat throughout the evening released it gradually into the surrounding air. This slow warmth created a small pocket of comfort within the cooler darkness beyond the circle of light. For those resting nearby, the ground itself carried a memory of the fire that had burned there only hours before. Over many generations, this pattern of gathering and sleeping near a hearth became a stable feature of human life. The fire did not create beds, but it changed the meaning of the ground where people rested. Instead of choosing sleeping places randomly across the landscape, groups often arranged themselves in relation to the warmth and light of the fire. The hearth acted as a quiet center point, around which the activities of the evening gradually transformed into the stillness of sleep. This structure shaped how humans experienced the transition between day and night. Evening did not end abruptly when darkness arrived. Instead, it passed slowly through stages. gathering, conversation, quiet preparation of the ground, and finally rest. The presence of fire allowed this transition to unfold gently. Archaeological evidence suggests that early humans maintained these hearths with care. Ash layers found at ancient sites often appear in repeated sequences, indicating that fires were rebuilt again and again in the same places. Around these hearths, archaeologists sometimes find traces of plant material or compacted soil where people likely rested. Although these traces are subtle, they reveal how closely sleeping places were connected to the fire itself. The hearth was not merely a tool for warmth or cooking. It helped organize the entire space where people lived during the evening hours. This connection between fire and sleep may also have influenced the timing of human rest. Before artificial lighting existed, the brightness of the fire provided one of the few sources of illumination after sunset. People could remain awake for a period of time near the flames, completing small tasks or sharing stories before fatigue gradually arrived. When the fire diminished and the surrounding darkness deepened, the environment naturally encouraged sleep. The ground near the embers became a quiet resting place as the group settled together. Anthropologists studying communities that continue to use fire in daily life sometimes observe similar evening rhythms. The fire gathers people into a shared space. As night progresses, activity slows, and individuals lie down nearby when they are ready to sleep. These observations offer a small window into what evenings may have looked like for early humans living long before the invention of beds. In such settings, the boundary between living space and sleeping space remained fluid. The same ground that supported the evening fire also became the surface where bodies rested until morning. For most of human history, this simple arrangement repeated itself across countless landscapes. The earth held the warmth of the fire, the group rested within its fading glow, and sleep arrived quietly without the presence of beds or raised structures. The ground and the hearth together formed the original architecture of human night. For most of human history, sleep was not an individual activity carried out in private space. It happened within the presence of others. Without beds separating each person into a distinct place, the boundaries between sleepers remained soft and flexible. Bodies rested close together on the ground, often arranged within the same shared area where the evening fire had burned. This pattern of communal sleep was not simply a cultural habit. It reflected the conditions in which early humans lived and the practical realities of surviving through the night in open environments. Darkness, in prehistoric landscapes, brought a different set of challenges than the day. Many animals became active after sunset, and unfamiliar sounds travelled easily across quiet ground. Sleeping alone in such conditions would have meant remaining vulnerable to threats that might approach silently through the dark. Resting together reduced this risk. Within a group, several people could remain lightly aware of their surroundings even while most were asleep. If one person stirred in response to a distant sound or movement, that awareness could pass quickly through the rest of the group. In this way, the sleeping circle created a shared layer of protection without requiring walls or structures. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer societies have observed similar patterns. In many communities where permanent beds are uncommon or absent, people often sleep in close proximity to one another. Families may rest within the same shelter or on the same open ground. The sounds of breathing, shifting bodies, or quiet voices become part of the natural background of the night. Instead of expecting silence and isolation, the human mind adapts to resting within the gentle presence of others. These observations provide clues about how early humans may have experienced sleep across most of our evolutionary history. The human nervous system appears capable of resting even when the environment remains socially active at a low level. Sleeping close together also helped maintain warmth during cooler nights. The human body produces heat continuously, even while asleep. When several people rest near each other, some of that warmth accumulates within the shared space, reducing the rate at which heat escapes into the surrounding air. This effect may have been especially valuable in environments where nights became cold after sunset. By forming clusters around a hearth or within a sheltered area, early humans created small pockets of warmth that made rest more comfortable. Archaeological evidence occasionally hints at these communal sleeping arrangements. At certain prehistoric sites, areas of compacted soil appear large enough to suggest that multiple individuals rested within the same space. Nearby, Traces of hearths and plant bedding indicate that these areas were used repeatedly. Although the exact positions of individual sleepers cannot be reconstructed, the scale and organization of these zones suggest shared resting spaces rather than isolated sleeping spots. The absence of beds allowed this communal pattern to develop naturally. Without raised surfaces separating individuals, the ground functioned as a continuous sleeping area where people could position themselves freely in relation to others. Children might sleep close to parents. Elders might remain near the center of the group where warmth and safety were greatest. These arrangements were flexible and could change depending on the needs of the group or the conditions of the night. Across thousands of generations, communal sleep became an ordinary feature of human life. The body relaxed in the presence of others, the ground supported everyone equally, and the quiet sounds of the group formed part of the nighttime environment. Long before bedrooms and individual beds appeared, the human experience of sleep was shaped by this shared closeness. When several people rested together on the ground, the space of sleep became something shared rather than divided. Without beds separating individuals into fixed positions, the arrangement of bodies remained flexible. People could move closer or farther apart depending on warmth, terrain, or the presence of children and elders within the group. This flexibility reflected the broader pattern of human life in prehistoric environments, where daily routines were shaped by changing landscapes rather than by permanent structures. The ground itself provided a continuous surface large enough to hold the entire group. Within this shared space, subtle patterns of organization often emerged. Younger children frequently slept near parents or other close relatives. Their smaller bodies benefited from the warmth created by adults nearby, and the presence of caregivers made it easier to respond if a child woke during the night. Elders, whose bodies might have been more sensitive to cold or uneven ground, often rested closer to the center of the group as well. These central positions offered the most stable warmth and protection. Meanwhile, younger adults sometimes settled toward the outer edges of the sleeping area. From these positions they could remain more aware of sounds beyond the group and respond if anything unusual occurred during the night. These arrangements were not strict rules but practical tendencies shaped by experience. Over many generations, people likely learned which positions within the group provided the greatest comfort and safety under different conditions. The shared sleeping space also influenced how individuals experienced the transition between waking and sleep. In modern bedrooms, people often expect silence and separation when they lie down. In prehistoric settings, the environment remained socially active for a longer period of time. Even as the fire dimmed and the group prepared to rest, small movements and quiet voices continued. Someone might shift the plant material beneath their body. Another might adjust a covering made from animal skin or leaves. These soft sounds gradually faded as more people fell asleep. Instead of complete silence, the night contained a gentle background of human presence. Anthropological observations suggest that the human mind can adapt easily to such environments when they are familiar. The sounds of breathing, occasional turning of bodies, or distant movement within the group become part of the normal landscape of sleep. Rather than disturbing rest, these signals may actually reinforce a sense of security by confirming that others remain nearby. For early humans living in open environments, this awareness of shared presence could have been deeply reassuring. The group itself functioned as a protective boundary within the darkness. Archaeological sites occasionally preserve hints of these communal arrangements. Large areas of compacted soil sometimes appear near hearths where repeated human occupation occurred. These surfaces are often broad enough to accommodate several individuals lying down within the same space. Although the precise number of sleepers cannot be determined, the scale of these areas suggests that rest was rarely solitary. Instead, the ground served as a collective sleeping surface where multiple bodies settled together each night. Over time, this shared pattern of rest shaped the human experience of nighttime. Sleep was not isolated behind walls or furniture. It unfolded within the quiet presence of others, close to the warmth of the hearth and the natural surface of the earth. For countless generations, the human body relaxed within this communal environment, surrounded by the subtle rhythms of the group resting together. As the night progressed and most members of the group drifted into deeper sleep, the shared nature of this resting space continued to shape the experience of the night. When people slept together on the ground, the boundary between wakefulness and sleep remained more fluid than it often is in modern bedrooms. A person who briefly awoke during the night could sense the presence of others nearby without needing to open their eyes fully. The quiet rhythm of breathing, the occasional shift of a body against the earth, or the soft crackle of cooling embers from the nearby fire all formed part of the environment in which rest unfolded. These sounds were not interruptions. Over generations they became familiar signals that the group remained intact and safe within the darkness. In environments where threats could appear without warning, this shared awareness offered a practical advantage. If an unusual sound emerged from beyond the sleeping area, perhaps the movement of an animal in nearby grass someone near the edge of the group might stir first. That movement alone could be enough to alert others lightly without fully waking them. The group therefore maintained a subtle level of awareness even during sleep. No individual was responsible for guarding the night continuously. Instead, small shifts in attention passed quietly between sleepers as different people moved between lighter and deeper stages of rest. Anthropologists sometimes describe this pattern as a form of distributed vigilance, where the group as a whole remains responsive even while individuals sleep. The absence of beds played an important role in allowing this shared awareness to function. When everyone rested on the same ground surface, movements were easier to sense. A change in posture or the sound of someone rising could travel across the sleeping area through the soil and the air. In modern settings where people sleep on separate raised beds or in different rooms, these signals become more isolated. In prehistoric environments, the shared surface of the earth connected sleepers more directly to one another. The closeness of the group also influenced how warmth and comfort were maintained through the night. As the air cooled toward the early hours of morning, bodies resting together helped retain heat within the shared space. Someone turning closer to the center of the group could easily benefit from this accumulated warmth. If the ground beneath one person became uncomfortable, they could shift slightly without needing to move far from the sleeping circle. This constant flexibility allowed the sleeping arrangement to adapt naturally to the changing conditions of the night. Archaeological evidence cannot record these quiet movements directly, yet the broad sleeping surfaces found at some ancient sites suggest that people had room to reposition themselves within the shared space. These surfaces were not divided into fixed individual spots. Instead, they formed open areas where bodies could arrange themselves in ways that felt comfortable in that moment. The ground functioned as a collective resting place rather than a set of assigned sleeping positions. Over thousands of generations, this communal structure shaped the way humans experienced sleep. Rest was intertwined with the presence of others, with the fading warmth of fire, and with the natural surface of the earth beneath the body. Beds did not define the place of sleep because they did not yet exist. The group itself, gathered together on the ground, formed the living structure within which sleep occurred. In this setting, the night belonged not to isolated individuals but to the quiet cooperation of many people resting side by side beneath the same sky. For most of human history, the landscape of daily life was constantly changing. Early human groups rarely remained in one place for long periods of time. Food sources moved with the seasons, animals migrated across wide territories, and water availability shifted with climate and weather. As a result, human communities developed a mobile way of living that allowed them to follow these changing resources. Campsites were temporary. A group might remain in one location for several days or weeks, but eventually the need to move would return. This constant movement shaped nearly every aspect of early human life, including how people slept at night. In a world organized around mobility, carrying heavy objects made little sense. Tools and belongings had to remain light enough to transport easily across long distances. Stone tools, small containers, and simple carrying materials could move with the group, but large pieces of furniture, including permanent sleeping structures, would have been impractical. Instead of transporting beds, people relied on the landscape itself to create a place for rest wherever they stopped for the night. The ground provided a surface that existed everywhere. With a small amount of preparation, clearing stones, gathering grasses, or spreading leaves, this surface could become a suitable place for sleep. Each evening repeated this simple process. A sleeping place was created, used, and then left behind as the group eventually moved on. Archaeological research supports this picture of frequent movement. Many prehistoric campsites show signs of brief occupation. Stone tools appear in scattered clusters. Hearths are relatively small, and plant bedding layers are thin. These patterns suggest that people used these sites temporarily before relocating to new areas. In some regions, groups may have returned to the same general locations during certain seasons, especially where water or plant resources were reliable. Yet even these returns did not usually involve building permanent sleeping structures. The landscape remained flexible, and sleeping places were recreated each time the group arrived. This mobile lifestyle also influenced how people thought about comfort. In modern societies, beds are designed to remain in one place and improve the sleeping experience through soft materials and stable construction. In prehistoric settings, comfort was achieved in simpler ways. People chose favorable ground, gathered plant materials, and positioned themselves within the group to maintain warmth and security. These methods required little effort and did not interfere with the ability to move quickly when necessary. The sleeping place was therefore temporary by design. It existed only for the duration of the night or for a short stay at a particular camp. Anthropologists studying contemporary hunter-gatherer communities often observe similar patterns. In many such groups, shelters and sleeping areas are simple and easily rebuilt. People prioritize flexibility rather than permanence. When a camp moves, most of the materials used for sleeping, grasses, leaves, or simple mats, are either carried lightly or gathered again at the next location. This approach reflects a practical understanding of mobility. The effort required to build heavy structures would slow movement and reduce the ability of the group to adapt to changing environments. For early humans, the absence of beds was therefore closely connected to the way life itself was organized. Movement across landscapes made permanent furniture unnecessary and often impossible. Instead, sleep remained closely tied to the natural surfaces of the earth and the materials that could be found nearby. Each new location offered a fresh patch of ground where rest could happen again. Over thousands of generations, this rhythm of movement and temporary rest defined the human relationship with sleep long before beds became part of daily life. Moving across landscapes meant that every evening carried a small moment of decision. As the day's travel slowed and the light began to fade, people had to choose where the group would stop. This choice was rarely permanent. It was shaped by immediate conditions, the presence of water nearby, the availability of food in the surrounding area, the direction of the wind, and the safety of the terrain. Once a suitable location was found, the camp formed quickly and quietly. Fires were prepared, tools set down, and the activities of the evening unfolded within a small temporary space. In such a world, the place of sleep could never become a fixed structure. It had to remain flexible enough to appear wherever the group paused. The ground itself provided that flexibility. A sleeping place did not need to be carried or constructed far in advance. It could be prepared within minutes by clearing stones, flattening vegetation, or gathering leaves and grasses to form a thin layer beneath the body. When morning arrived and the group prepared to move again, these materials remained behind. The next evening, a similar process would happen again in a different part of the landscape. Over thousands of generations, this repeated rhythm shaped the human relationship with rest. Sleep was not tied to a specific object. It was tied to the ability to transform a piece of ground into a temporary resting place whenever needed. Archaeological studies of prehistoric campsites often reveal evidence of this repeated pattern. Many sites contain only thin layers of occupation, suggesting that groups remained there for short periods before moving on. The remains of fires appear in small clusters rather than large permanent hearths. Tools are scattered across the ground rather than stored in long-lasting structures. In such places, any sleeping surfaces made from plants would have decomposed quickly after the camp was abandoned. What remains today are only faint traces of human presence. Fragments of stone tools, small patches of ash, and subtle changes in soil where people once gathered. These traces remind us how temporary most human camps once were. The idea of building a heavy sleeping structure would have conflicted with this mobile way of life. Carrying large objects across long distances required energy that early humans could rarely spare. Mobility allowed groups to follow migrating animals, discover new plant resources, and respond to changes in climate. The ability to move easily was therefore one of the most important strategies for survival. Everything people owned needed to support that mobility. Simple tools could be carried by hand. Animal skins could serve as clothing, coverings, or temporary sleeping layers. But large, permanent furniture would have limited movement and slowed the group's ability to adapt to new environments. Anthropologists studying modern mobile societies observe similar priorities. When communities know that they will relocate frequently, they design their belongings to remain light and easily replaced. A sleeping surface may consist of a woven mat or gathered vegetation that can be rolled, carried, or recreated in a new location. The emphasis is not on permanence, but on reliability. Wherever the group travels, the landscape itself provides the materials needed for rest. This approach mirrors the conditions that shaped human life for most of our species' history. Each night the same quiet routine returned. Find a safe place, prepare the ground, gather simple materials, and lie down. When morning came, the camp dissolved back into movement. The sleeping place disappeared almost as quickly as it had formed, leaving the earth ready to receive the next group that might pass through the same landscape in the future. Across thousands of generations, this rhythm of movement shaped how humans understood the idea of a place to sleep. A sleeping area was never meant to last very long. It appeared briefly at the end of the day and disappeared again when the group moved on. Because of this, the human relationship with sleep remained closely tied to the landscape itself rather than to any permanent object. The ground was always available, whether in open plains, forest clearings, or near riverbanks. Wherever people travelled, a new sleeping place could be created with the materials found nearby. This flexibility was essential in a world where survival depended on following changing resources. The constant movement of human groups also meant that camps rarely developed the kind of long-term structure that might encourage furniture or built sleeping platforms. Archaeological sites from the deep past often show signs of brief occupation rather than permanent settlement. Layers of ash from small fires appear thin and scattered. Stone tools are found where they were used rather than carefully stored. Plant bedding, if it existed, would have decayed quickly once the camp was abandoned. These patterns suggest that people expected their living spaces to remain temporary. The camp was simply a pause within a larger journey across the landscape. Under these conditions, the effort required to build something like a bed would have brought little benefit. Any structure heavy enough to raise the body from the ground would either have to be carried during travel or abandoned after only a short period of use. Both choices would have been inefficient in a lifestyle where energy and time were carefully balanced against travel or a benind. Instead, early humans relied on methods that required almost no construction at all. The earth provided a stable surface. Grasses, leaves, or animal skins could soften that surface when needed. When the group moved on, these materials returned naturally to the environment without leaving a permanent trace. This long period of mobility lasted for most of human history. Only in the relatively recent past, within the last 10,000 years, did some human societies begin to settle in one place for longer periods through agriculture and permanent villages. Before that transition, the human world remained in motion. Camps formed and dissolved repeatedly as groups followed animals, gathered seasonal plants, or sought new water sources. Sleep followed the same pattern. It was an activity that adapted easily to movement because it depended on the environment rather than on built structures. Anthropologists studying mobile societies today sometimes observe similar practices. When people know they will relocate soon, they avoid investing effort in building heavy or permanent sleeping furniture. Instead, they create sleeping surfaces that can be replaced easily or gathered again in the next location. This approach reflects a long-standing human strategy, using the flexibility of the environment rather than carrying fixed structures across the landscape. For most of our species' existence, this strategy worked effectively. The human body rested directly on the earth, supported by simple materials gathered at the end of the day. When the sun rose again, the sleeping place faded back into the landscape as the group resumed its journey. Over countless generations, this pattern repeated itself across forests, grasslands, deserts, and coastlines. The absence of beds was not unusual in such a world. It was simply the natural result of living in motion, where every night required creating a resting place that would vanish with the morning light. For a very long time, the human relationship with sleep remained closely connected to the ground. Yet gradually, in certain environments and under specific conditions, small changes began to appear. These changes did not immediately create what we would recognize as a bed. Instead, they introduced the first experiments in lifting the body slightly above the earth. The reasons for these experiments often came directly from the environment. In some regions, the ground carried persistent moisture after rain. In others, insects or small animals moved easily through the soil at night, Resting directly on the earth in such places could become uncomfortable or occasionally unsafe. Over time, humans began to explore simple ways of creating a small barrier between the body and the ground beneath it. One of the earliest solutions was remarkably simple: raising plant materials higher from the soil. Instead of placing grasses and leaves directly on the ground, people sometimes layered them more thickly or arranged branches beneath them to create a slightly elevated surface. These structures were still temporary and light. A few branches laid across each other could support a thin bedding layer, lifting the sleeper just a small distance above the soil. In forest environments where wood was abundant, such arrangements may have been relatively easy to create. The goal was not to build furniture, but simply to improve comfort by reducing contact with damp ground or insects. Archaeological evidence of these early raised sleeping surfaces is extremely rare because the materials involved decay quickly. Wood, leaves, and grasses break down within years or decades, unless preserved in unusual conditions. However, indirect clues appear in certain archaeological sites, where the distribution of plant materials and soil compression suggests that bedding surfaces were sometimes thicker or structured differently than simple ground layers. Ethnographic observations of traditional societies also provide hints about how such sleeping platforms might have functioned. In some tropical environments today, people construct light sleeping frames from branches or woven plant fibers to lift the body slightly above the ground. These structures remain simple and portable, often assembled quickly using materials available in the surrounding forest. The idea of raising the body above the earth, therefore, did not appear suddenly as a complex invention. It likely developed gradually, as people responded to environmental challenges. In areas where insects were especially active or where soil retained moisture, elevating the sleeper even a short distance could make a noticeable difference. Yet these early solutions remained temporary and closely tied to the immediate environment. They were built from natural materials, used for a short period, and then abandoned when the group moved on. The ground itself still played the central role in human sleep. Even when branches or thicker plant layers were used, these materials rested directly on the earth and returned to it after use. Over thousands of years, such small adjustments represented the earliest steps towards separating the human body from the ground during sleep. But these steps were modest and rare compared with the long tradition of resting directly on natural surfaces. For the majority of human history, the earth continued to serve as the primary foundation of rest. The few early experiments with raised sleeping surfaces were simply practical responses to specific environments, rather than a complete transformation of how humans slept. In certain environments, the advantages of lifting the body slightly above the ground became more noticeable over time. Regions with dense vegetation, frequent rain, or large insect populations created conditions where sleeping directly on the earth could become uncomfortable. Moisture collected easily in the soil after storms. Small insects moved through the ground at night. In these places, even a small separation between the body and the earth could improve rest. As a result, humans in some regions began experimenting with simple structures that raised sleeping surfaces just a short distance above the ground. These structures were still very different from the beds that appear much later in history. They were usually made from materials gathered quickly from the surrounding landscape. Branches might be placed side by side to form a loose platform. Flexible plant stems or vines could be woven between them to create a surface that supported a layer of leaves or grasses. In forest environments where wood was abundant, such platforms could be assembled within a short time using nothing more than basic tools or even bare hands. The purpose was not to create furniture but to improve the immediate conditions of sleep. Raising the body even a few centimeters above damp soil reduced direct contact with moisture and made it more difficult for insects to reach the sleeper. Observations of traditional communities in tropical regions provide insight into how these kinds of structures may have functioned. In some areas, people still construct light sleeping platforms or frames from wood and plant fibers when resting in forest camps. These platforms are usually simple and temporary. They can be assembled in the evening and abandoned when the group moves on. The materials remain part of the surrounding environment rather than becoming permanent structures. Such practices illustrate how humans have long adapted their sleeping environments using natural resources available nearby. Archaeological evidence for these early raised sleeping surfaces remains extremely limited because wood and plant materials decay quickly. Unlike stone tools or bones, the components of these platforms rarely survive long enough to be preserved in the soil. However, indirect signs sometimes appear at sites where human occupation lasted for extended periods. At certain locations, archaeologists have noticed patterns in the distribution of plant remains or soil compression that suggest thicker bedding layers or more structured sleeping surfaces. Although these clues cannot prove the exact form of early platforms, they hint that humans occasionally modified their sleeping places in ways that lifted the body slightly above the earth. Even with these adaptations, the basic relationship between humans and the ground remained largely unchanged. The earth continued to provide the main foundation for rest. Raised surfaces were typically low, temporary, and built only when environmental conditions made them useful. Most sleeping places were still created directly on the ground, using layers of vegetation or animal skins. The idea of constructing permanent beds had not yet appeared, because the broader structure of human life remained mobile and flexible. These early experiments with elevation therefore represent small adjustments rather than a complete transformation of sleep. Humans were responding to specific challenges in their surroundings: damp soil, insects, or uneven ground, by adding simple structures beneath their bedding materials. Over thousands of years, such solutions demonstrated the human ability to modify the environment in subtle ways to improve comfort. Yet even as these small innovations appeared, the ground itself remained the most common and familiar surface for sleep across nearly all of human history. Over long stretches of time, these small experiments with raising sleeping surfaces remained limited in scale. They appeared mainly in environments where the ground itself created difficulties for rest. In dry grasslands or open plains where soil remained firm and relatively free of insects, sleeping directly on the earth continued to work well. A thin layer of grasses or leaves was often enough to make the surface comfortable. In these places, there was little reason to build anything more complex. The effort required to construct raised platforms would not have offered significant advantages compared with the simplicity of resting directly on the ground. Because early humans moved frequently across landscapes, most sleeping places still needed to remain temporary. Even when branches or woven plant materials were used to lift the sleeper slightly above the soil, these structures were usually light and easily abandoned. A few pieces of wood placed across each other could support a bedding layer for a single night. When the group moved the next day, those branches remained behind and slowly returned to the surrounding environment. Nothing about these structures suggested permanence. They were practical adjustments made for a particular place and time, rather than a new standard for how humans slept. Archaeologists rarely find clear remains of these early raised surfaces because the materials involved decay quickly. Wood breaks down in soil unless preserved under unusual conditions, and plant fibers disappear even faster. For this reason, most evidence of prehistoric sleeping places still appears in the form of plant bedding layers on the ground, rather than elevated structures. Yet, ethnographic observations provide clues about how such temporary platforms may have looked. In several regions of the world where traditional lifestyles persist, people sometimes construct simple sleeping frames from branches when camping in wet or insect-rich environments. These frames lift the body slightly above the soil while remaining light enough to assemble quickly and leave behind when the camp moves. Such practices illustrate how humans can modify their sleeping environment without creating permanent furniture. These early raised sleeping surfaces did not yet represent the invention of the bed. They were closer to temporary platforms than to built furniture. The body still rested on natural materials such as leaves, grasses, or animal skins placed above the frame. The difference was only the small gap between the sleeper and the earth beneath. Even that small separation could improve comfort in certain conditions by reducing dampness or discouraging insects. But for most landscapes and for most nights, the ground itself remained the most practical place to sleep. What these early experiments reveal is the gradual nature of human innovation. New ideas rarely appear suddenly in their final form. Instead, they begin as small adjustments that solve immediate problems. Over time, if those solutions prove useful, they may develop into more stable practices. The first raised sleeping surfaces likely began in this way. Simple responses to environmental challenges rather than deliberate attempts to create furniture. Only much later, when human societies began to settle more permanently in one place, would the idea of constructing dedicated sleeping structures grow into something recognizable as a bed. Before that transformation occurred, the relationship between the human body and the earth remained largely unchanged. The ground continued to serve as the primary foundation of sleep, just as it had for countless generations before. For most of human history, movement across the landscape shaped how people lived, ate, and slept. Camps formed briefly and then disappeared as groups followed animals, gathered seasonal plants, or searched for reliable water. But gradually, in some regions of the world, a different pattern began to emerge. Instead of moving continuously, certain communities started remaining in one place for longer periods of time. This shift did not happen everywhere at once. It appeared slowly and unevenly across different parts of the world as humans began experimenting with early forms of agriculture and more stable food supplies. When people started cultivating plants and storing harvested food, the need to move constantly began to change. Fields required attention across seasons, and stored grain needed protection. Over time, these responsibilities encouraged groups to return repeatedly to the same location or remain there for much longer than earlier hunter-gatherer camps allowed. As this process continued, temporary camps gradually evolved into more stable villages. These settlements introduced something that had rarely existed in earlier human history: buildings that remained in place year after year. The appearance of permanent structures began to reshape many aspects of daily life, including how people slept. When houses became stable features of the landscape, the ground inside them could also become a more stable place for rest. Unlike open camps that disappeared when a group moved on, houses created a defined interior space where sleeping could occur repeatedly in the same location. Archaeological evidence from early farming settlements shows how these changes unfolded. In ancient villages dating back roughly 10,000 years, researchers often find houses built from mud, brick, stone, or packed earth. Inside these structures, floors appear worn and compacted from repeated use over long periods of time. In some cases, slightly raised areas of the floor suggest places where people regularly rested. These surfaces may have been covered with mats, animal skins, or layers of plant material to make them more comfortable. Although these sleeping places were still simple compared with modern beds, they represented an important shift. For the first time in human history, sleep began occurring repeatedly in the same interior spaces rather than in temporary camps scattered across the landscape. This stability allowed new possibilities to emerge. When people remained in one place long enough, they could begin shaping the interior of their homes more deliberately. Floors might be smoothed or leveled to create better sleeping surfaces. Mats woven from plant fibers could remain inside the house instead of being discarded when a camp moved. Animal skins used as coverings or bedding could be stored and reused night after night. These small changes gradually transformed the relationship between humans and their sleeping environment. The ground was still the primary surface of rest, but it now existed inside a structure that remained constant over time. The transition from mobility to settlement therefore marked an important step in the long story of human sleep. As villages formed and houses became permanent, the conditions that once prevented the development of beds began to fade. When people lived in motion, sleeping places had to remain temporary and easily replaced. But when communities settled, the sleeping space itself became stable. The same patch of floor could serve as a resting place for years or even generations. This new stability created the first conditions in which more permanent sleeping structures might eventually appear. Yet even in these early villages, beds as we know them were still rare or non-existent. Most people continued to rest on mats, skins, or prepared floor surfaces within their homes. The transformation from ground-based sleep to raised beds would take many more centuries to unfold. As human communities began to remain in one place for longer periods of time, the structure of daily life slowly became more predictable. Fields needed to be planted and harvested according to seasonal cycles. Stored food had to be protected from animals and moisture. Houses were repaired, expanded, and sometimes rebuilt on the same spot. This growing stability meant that people returned to the same sleeping spaces night after night. For the first time in human history, the place where someone rested at night might remain unchanged for many years. The ground inside the house gradually became familiar in a way that the temporary camps of earlier times never allowed. Archaeological evidence from early agricultural settlements reveals how these indoor sleeping areas developed. In many Neolithic villages, houses were built with compacted earth floors or carefully smoothed clay surfaces. Over time, Repeated use created visible patterns on these floors. Certain areas appear more worn than others, suggesting that people return to the same parts of the house to rest each night. In some cases, archaeologists have discovered woven mats or impressions left by organic materials that once covered the ground. Although the mats themselves often decayed long ago, the marks they left behind provide clues about how people prepared these indoor sleeping surfaces. The presence of permanent houses also allowed people to store objects related to sleep. In earlier mobile societies, plant bedding or temporary mats were usually discarded when a camp moved. In settled communities, these materials could remain inside the house and be used repeatedly. Woven plant mats became especially useful because they could be rolled, stored, and placed on the floor each evening. Animal skins used as coverings or padding could also remain in the same household for long periods of time. These items made the sleeping area more comfortable without requiring large permanent structures. Even with these improvements, the ground inside the house remained the primary surface for rest. Most early agricultural communities did not yet use raised beds. Instead, sleep continued to occur close to the earth, much as it had for thousands of years before. The difference was that the environment around that ground had changed. Instead of sleeping beneath open sky or in temporary shelters, people now rested within walls that protected them from wind and rain. This protection made the sleeping area more stable and predictable. The surface of the floor stayed relatively dry, and the same bedding materials could be reused night after night. Over time, this repeated use of indoor sleeping spaces encouraged people to shape the interior of their homes more deliberately. Floors might be leveled to remove uneven ground. Raised edges of packed earth sometimes appeared along the walls of houses, possibly serving as low platforms for sitting or resting. These features were still very simple compared with later furniture, yet they represent early steps towards structuring the sleeping environment. The idea that certain parts of the house were intended for rest began to take shape. The transition to settled life, therefore, changed more than just where humans lived. It also began to reshape the experience of sleep itself. The nightly search for a new patch of ground gradually disappeared as houses provided stable surfaces for rest. Instead of creating a sleeping place from scratch every evening, people could return to the same indoor area prepared for that purpose. Although beds had not yet appeared, the conditions that would eventually allow their development were beginning to form. Human sleep was slowly becoming tied not only to the ground, but also to the structure of the home surrounding it. As settled villages continued to develop, the experience of nighttime slowly changed in ways that earlier mobile communities had never known. When people returned to the same house each evening, the interior space of that structure began to shape how rest unfolded. The ground inside the house was no longer just a random patch of earth chosen for a single night. It became a familiar surface, one that might be used again and again by the same individuals over many seasons. Over time, this repeated use created subtle patterns in the home itself. Certain corners of the floor became associated with sleeping, while other areas were used for cooking, storage, or daily work. Archaeological excavations of early farming settlements often reveal these patterns through wear marks and traces left in the soil. Floors in ancient houses sometimes show smooth, compacted areas where repeated human activity occurred. These zones may represent places where mats were laid out each night, or where families gathered to rest together. In some settlements, archaeologists have even found slight changes in floor elevation, small raised areas built from packed earth along the edges of rooms. These features may have served multiple purposes, including seating during the day and sleeping surfaces at night. Although these raised sections were not beds in the modern sense, they represent an early effort to shape the sleeping environment inside permanent structures. The presence of walls and roofs also changed how people experienced the ground beneath them. In earlier periods, sleeping directly on the earth meant sharing the open environment with wind, insects, and shifting weather conditions. Inside a house, the same ground became more stable. Rain no longer fell directly onto the sleeping surface. Wind was reduced by the surrounding walls. Fireplaces inside the house or nearby provided warmth that could linger in the enclosed space through the night. These changes made the ground inside a house feel different from the ground outside. It became a controlled environment where sleep could occur more comfortably and predictably. The stability of indoor sleeping spaces also encouraged the development of household objects connected to rest. Woven mats made from plant fibers became more common in some regions. These mats could remain inside the house and be reused each night rather than discarded after a temporary camp. Animal skins and simple coverings might also be kept within the household, providing warmth or padding on top of the floor. These materials softened the surface without requiring complex construction. The ground remained the main support for the body, but layers placed above it gradually improved comfort. Over time, the idea of shaping indoor space specifically for sleep became more visible. Houses began to contain areas that were clearly intended for resting. Yet even at this stage, raised beds were still uncommon for most people. The tradition of sleeping close to the earth remained deeply rooted in human life. Thousands of generations had grown accustomed to resting on the ground, and the simple combination of floor, mat, and covering was often sufficient. What had changed was not the presence of a bed, but the stability of the sleeping place. Instead of disappearing each morning when a camp moved on, the sleeping surface remained inside the house, waiting for the next night to arrive. This shift represented an important step in the long transformation of human sleep. The environment surrounding rest had become more permanent, even though the surface itself was still the earth beneath the home. For thousands of years after the first villages appeared, most people still slept close to the ground. Even though houses had become permanent structures, the tradition of resting on mats, skins, or simple bedding placed on the floor continued across many cultures. Yet gradually, within some early civilizations, a new idea began to take shape. Instead of placing bedding directly on the ground, people started constructing objects designed specifically to hold the body during sleep. These early structures represent the first clear ancestors of what we now call a bed. The appearance of such objects did not happen suddenly or everywhere at the same time. It emerged slowly within societies where permanent buildings, specialized crafts, and social hierarchies were becoming more complex. Archaeological evidence from ancient civilizations offers some of the earliest examples of these raised sleeping structures. In ancient Egypt, beds appear in tomb paintings and in preserved wooden furniture dating back more than 4,000 years. Some of these beds have survived remarkably well in dry desert environments where wood decays very slowly. These ancient Egyptian beds were built from wooden frames supported by legs that lifted the sleeping surface above the ground. Across the frame, craftsmen stretched woven cords or leather strips to create a flexible surface where the sleeper could lie. On top of this structure, mats or cushions were sometimes placed to provide additional comfort. Compared with the simple plant bedding used for most of human history, these raised frames represented a significant change. For the first time, the human body was separated clearly from the earth during sleep. Similar developments appeared in other early civilizations. In ancient Mesopotamia, which developed along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, written records and archaeological findings suggest that raised sleeping furniture existed among wealthier households. Clay tablets and artistic depictions sometimes show individuals reclining on elevated platforms or wooden frames. These objects were not common for the majority of the population. Most people likely continued to sleep on mats placed directly on the floor of their homes. Yet the presence of raised beds among certain groups reveals an important shift in how sleep could be structured. In societies where craftsmanship and resources allowed furniture to be built and maintained, the sleeping surface could become a separate object, rather than a simple layer on the ground. The emergence of beds in these civilizations was closely connected to changes in social organization. As societies grew more complex, differences in wealth and status became more visible. Furniture itself often reflected these differences. A raised bed required materials such as wood, leather, or woven fibers, along with the skills of craftsmen who could assemble them. These resources were not always available to everyone. As a result, early beds were often associated with elite households, royal families, or individuals of high social status. In ancient Egypt, for example, beds found in tombs often belonged to nobles or members of the ruling class. The design of these beds sometimes included carved decorations or carefully shaped legs, indicating that they were not only practical objects but also symbols of wealth and refinement. For most people, however, the tradition of sleeping on the ground continued. Even within civilizations that developed furniture, beds remained relatively rare for a long time. The majority of households relied on mats, woven textiles, or animal skins placed on the floor. These materials were easy to produce and could be replaced when worn. The raised bed was therefore not an immediate replacement for ground-based sleep. Instead, it began as a specialized object used by a small portion of society. Its existence marked an important turning point in the history of human rest, yet it would take many centuries before beds became common enough to transform the everyday experience of sleep for most people. The earliest beds that appeared in ancient civilizations were often simple in structure, yet they represented a significant shift in how humans related to the ground during sleep. Instead of resting directly on mats placed on the floor, the sleeper now lay on a wooden frame supported by legs that lifted the body above the earth. This elevation changed several practical aspects of sleep. Air could circulate beneath the frame, helping reduce moisture that sometimes collected on floors made from packed earth or stone. Insects moving along the ground had more difficulty reaching the sleeper. The surface itself, formed by woven cords or leather strips stretched across the frame, created a flexible support that responded slightly to the weight of the body. Although these beds were still quite firm compared with modern mattresses, they introduced a new physical experience, the body resting on an object designed specifically for sleep. Archaeological discoveries from ancient Egypt provide some of the clearest examples of how these early beds were constructed. In several tombs, remarkably preserved wooden beds have been found, protected by the dry desert climate. Many of these beds were relatively narrow and slightly curved along their length, forming a gentle slope from head to foot. The frames were often made from sturdy woods such as acacia or tamarisk. Leather or plant fibers were woven across the frame to create the sleeping surface. In some cases, small headrests made from wood or stone were used instead of soft pillows. These headrests supported the neck and kept the head elevated while leaving the face uncovered. Such designs reflect the practical and cultural preferences of the time, rather than the comfort standards of modern bedding. In other early civilizations, raised sleeping platforms also appeared in different forms. In Mesopotamia, where wood was less abundant than in some other regions, raised sleeping surfaces were sometimes constructed from clay or built as permanent platforms within the house itself. These platforms might be covered with woven mats or textiles to soften the surface. Instead of a separate piece of furniture that could be moved easily, the sleeping place could become part of the structure of the home. This approach shows how different environments influenced the development of early beds. The idea of lifting the body above the ground remained consistent, but the materials and construction methods varied depending on local resources. Even as these raised sleeping structures developed, they did not immediately replace older traditions of ground-based sleep. Most people continued to rely on mats, skins, or textiles spread directly across the floor of their homes. Raised beds required time, materials, and craftsmanship that were not always available to ordinary households. In many ancient communities, the bed remained a relatively rare object associated with individuals who had greater access to resources. The majority of the population still slept in ways that would have been familiar to humans living thousands of years earlier. Yet the existence of these early beds marked an important moment in the long evolution of human sleep. For the first time, the sleeping surface had become a crafted object rather than a temporary arrangement of natural materials. The body no longer rested directly on the earth but on a structure intentionally built to support it. Although this change affected only a small portion of the population at first, it introduced a new possibility: sleep separated from the ground through human design. Over the centuries that followed, this idea would slowly spread and transform how people rested at night. Even after the first beds appeared in ancient civilizations, they remained rare objects for a very long time. The existence of these raised sleeping structures did not immediately change how most people rested at night. In many early societies, the bed was not a common household item but a symbol of status and wealth. Building one required materials that were not always easy to obtain, along with the skills of craftsmen capable of shaping wood, weaving strong fibers, or assembling stable frames. As a result, beds were often found in the homes of rulers, nobles, or individuals who held important positions within society. Archaeological discoveries from ancient Egypt illustrate this pattern clearly. Beds discovered in tombs often belonged to members of the elite. Some were carefully carved from wood and decorated with artistic details that reflected the owner's status. In royal tombs, beds sometimes appear alongside other finely crafted furniture, including chairs, chests, and ceremonial objects. These items reveal how furniture itself had become part of a social display. Sleeping above the ground was not only practical but also associated with prestige and refinement. The bed became an object that signaled the position of its owner within the social hierarchy. For the majority of people living in these civilizations, however, daily life remained much closer to older traditions. Most households did not possess wooden beds or elaborate furniture. Instead, families continued to sleep on mats, woven textiles, or animal skins placed directly on the floor of their homes. These materials were easier to produce and replace when worn. They required little craftsmanship and could be adapted to the size of the living space. In many regions, such sleeping arrangements remained the norm for centuries, even after beds had been invented. Historical records from various cultures confirm that ground-based sleeping persisted widely. In parts of the ancient Mediterranean world, for example, simple bedding laid on the floor was common among ordinary families. In many Asian societies, woven mats or padded textiles served as the primary sleeping surface inside homes. These traditions reflect a long continuity with earlier human history. Even as furniture gradually appeared, the habit of sleeping close to the earth remained deeply rooted in everyday life. The spread of beds, therefore, happened slowly and unevenly across different societies. In some regions, they became more common among wealthy households and urban populations. In others, they remained unusual or unnecessary for long periods of time. Cultural preferences also played a role. Some communities continued to value the simplicity of sleeping on mats or floor surfaces even when raised beds were available. Comfort was defined not only by the height of the sleeping surface but also by familiarity with long-standing traditions. When viewed across the entire timeline of human history, the invention of the bed marks an important turning point, but it does not represent an immediate transformation. For thousands of years after the first beds appeared, the majority of humans still rested on the ground or on thin bedding placed directly above it. The bed existed, yet it belonged mainly to a small portion of society. The earth continued to support most human sleep just as it had for countless generations before. Only much later would beds begin to spread more widely and reshape the everyday experience of rest for ordinary people. For many centuries after the first beds appeared, the majority of people across the world continued to sleep close to the ground. Even in societies where furniture had begun to develop, beds remained uncommon outside the homes of the wealthy. Most households relied on simpler solutions that had existed for generations. Woven mats, padded textiles, or animal skins were spread across the floor each evening and rolled away again when the day began. These sleeping arrangements were practical, affordable, and well suited to homes where living space served many different purposes throughout the day. The floor itself remained the central surface for rest, just as it had been during the earliest periods of human history. Historical records from ancient and medieval societies reveal how widespread these practices remained. In many parts of the world, houses contained a single main room where cooking, work, and rest all took place. During the evening, bedding materials were laid out across the floor so that family members could sleep together within the same space. When morning arrived, these materials were folded or stored to allow the room to return to its daytime activities. This flexible use of space reflected both the limited size of many homes and the long tradition of sleeping without permanent furniture. Beds existed, but they were often reserved for individuals who possessed greater wealth or social standing. In medieval Europe, for example, beds were valuable household objects that required wood, textiles, and skilled craftsmanship. Constructing a wooden bed frame demanded access to carpentry tools and suitable materials, which were not always available to ordinary families. As a result, beds were more commonly found in castles, monasteries, and the homes of nobles. Some of these beds were large structures with wooden frames, rope supports, and thick coverings designed to provide warmth during cold nights. Curtains or canopies sometimes surrounded them to retain heat and offer privacy within large rooms. While these beds appear prominently in historical descriptions, they represented only a small portion of how people actually slept. For most villagers and labourers, the nightly routine remained much simpler. A straw-filled mattress, a woven mat, or a bundle of blankets might be placed directly on the floor. In some households, loose straw was spread across the ground and covered with cloth to create a soft surface. These arrangements could be replaced easily when the materials wore out, making them more practical than expensive furniture. Even in homes where a bed existed, it was not always used by every member of the family. Sometimes several people shared the bed, while others slept nearby on mats or simple bedding. Similar patterns appeared in many other regions beyond Europe. In parts of Asia, for instance, Woven mats or padded textiles placed directly on the floor remained the primary sleeping surface for generations. These traditions often continued even in cultures that were familiar with raised beds. The ground inside the home, covered with carefully prepared bedding materials, provided a stable and comfortable place to rest. Cultural habits and long familiarity with these practices meant that beds were not always seen as necessary. Looking across the long history of human sleep, this period reveals an important truth. The invention of the bed did not instantly replace earlier ways of resting. For thousands of years, most people continued to sleep in ways that would have been recognizable to their distant ancestors. The ground inside the home, softened by mats or straw, remained the everyday foundation of human rest. Beds existed, but they belonged mainly to those who could afford the materials and labor required to build them. Even in places where beds were known and occasionally used, the everyday experience of sleep for most people remained closely tied to the floor of the home. Houses were often small, and the space inside them had to serve many purposes. During the day, the same room might be used for cooking, repairing tools, weaving cloth, or storing food. When night arrived, the room transformed into a sleeping space for the entire household. Instead of fixed furniture occupying the floor permanently, bedding materials could be spread out when needed and removed again in the morning. This flexible use of space made floor sleeping practical for families living in modest homes. Across many societies, the materials used for bedding were simple but effective. Straw, dried grasses, woven mats, or padded textiles provided a soft layer between the body and the ground. These materials could be replaced easily when they wore out. A straw mattress, for example, might be filled with fresh straw or plant fibers each season. Woven mats made from reeds or grasses were lightweight and could be rolled or stored when not in use. Animal skins or blankets offered additional warmth during colder nights. Together, these layers created a sleeping surface that was comfortable enough for rest without requiring permanent furniture. Historical descriptions from medieval Europe illustrate how common such practices were. Many homes did not contain a bed frame at all. Instead, a bundle of straw covered by cloth formed a simple mattress placed directly on the floor. Families often slept together within the same space, sharing blankets or coverings to conserve warmth. In colder regions, sleeping close together helped maintain body heat during the night. Even in houses that possessed a wooden bed, it was often reserved for the head of the household or for guests, while other family members slept nearby on mats or straw bedding. Similar patterns existed in other parts of the world. In East Asia, for instance, sleeping on mats or padded floor bedding remained common for centuries. In Japan, woven tatami mats and layered bedding materials created a comfortable sleeping surface placed directly on the floor. These bedding sets could be folded and stored during the day, allowing the room to function for other activities. In many regions of the Middle East and Central Asia, carpets or thick textiles served a similar purpose. The floor of the home, covered with layered fabrics, became a soft and adaptable place for rest. These traditions demonstrate that sleeping close to the ground was not always seen as a sign of poverty or hardship. In many cultures, it was simply the normal way people organized their homes. Beds were known and sometimes admired, but they were not essential for comfort. Generations had grown accustomed to resting on mats, straw, or layered fabrics placed directly on the floor. These methods connected daily life with a very long human tradition that stretched back far beyond recorded history. When viewed across centuries, the spread of beds happened slowly and unevenly. Even as furniture became more available in some regions, large portions of the population continued to rely on floor-based sleeping arrangements. The human body had adapted to resting in this way over thousands of years, and many communities saw little reason to change a system that already worked well. For long stretches of history, the contrast between beds and floor sleeping reflected more than comfort alone. It also revealed differences in wealth, access to materials, and the structure of everyday homes. A bed required wood strong enough to support a frame, tools to shape it, and textiles or woven materials to create a surface for sleeping. These elements demanded time, labor, and resources. In many communities, especially those where most people worked as farmers or laborers, such resources were limited. As a result, raised beds remained relatively rare for ordinary households. The floor of the home continued to serve as the most reliable and accessible place to rest. Historical documents from various regions confirm that many families owned little furniture beyond simple tools and storage containers. When night arrived, sleeping surfaces were created from materials already available within the household. A mat woven from reeds might be unrolled across the floor. Blankets or cloths were placed on top to provide warmth. In colder climates, straw or dried grasses were sometimes packed into cloth sacks to form basic mattresses. These materials could be replaced easily whenever they became worn. Because they required few resources, they remained the most practical solution for the majority of the population. Even in towns and cities where furniture workshops existed, beds were not always widely distributed among ordinary people. In medieval Europe, for example, carpenters and craftsmen could produce wooden bed frames, but these items were relatively expensive compared with other household goods. Beds therefore appeared most often in the homes of merchants, nobles, and wealthy families. Written inventories from that time sometimes list beds alongside other valuable possessions such as chests, metal cookware, or fine textiles. Owning a bed signaled a certain level of prosperity, yet outside these households, many people continued sleeping on straw bedding or simple mats placed directly on the floor. Cultural traditions also reinforced the persistence of floor sleeping. In many societies, sleeping close to the ground remained familiar and comfortable because it had been practiced for generations. Families grew accustomed to preparing bedding each evening and storing it again during the day. This routine allowed the same room to serve many purposes. A space used for eating, working, or gathering during daylight could easily transform into a sleeping area once darkness arrived. Beds, by contrast, occupied permanent space and were less adaptable in smaller homes. In regions where houses contained only one or two rooms, flexible bedding often remained the more practical choice. The continuation of these practices reveals how slowly major changes in daily life can spread. Although beds had existed for thousands of years, their presence did not immediately reshape how most people slept. The human body had long adapted to resting on mats, straw, or layered textiles placed on the ground. These methods required little construction and could be adjusted easily according to the needs of the household. As a result, they remained widespread even as furniture gradually became more common in wealthier communities. Looking across the long arc of history, the bed began as a specialized object used by a small minority. For much of the population, the ground inside the home, softened by simple bedding, continued to provide the foundation of sleep. Only in more recent centuries would beds become common enough to transform the everyday experience of rest for most people. For most of human history, the place of sleep remained simple and flexible. Mats could be rolled out across the floor, straw bedding could be arranged wherever space allowed, and families often rested together within the same room. Yet gradually, over the last few centuries, the design of homes began to change in ways that reshaped how people slept. Houses grew larger in many regions, and the number of rooms inside them increased. Instead of one shared space serving many purposes, homes slowly developed areas dedicated to specific activities. Cooking, storage, and rest began to occur in separate parts of the house. This transformation introduced a new idea that had rarely existed before. The bedroom, as a distinct place, meant primarily for sleeping. The appearance of bedrooms was closely connected to broader changes in society. As towns expanded and trade networks grew, new materials and forms of furniture became more widely available. Carpentry techniques improved, and wooden furniture could be produced in larger quantities. At the same time, the growing middle classes in many regions began to furnish their homes with objects that had once belonged mainly to the wealthy. Beds gradually became more accessible as production methods improved and materials became easier to obtain. Instead of being rare symbols of status, they slowly entered ordinary households. Historical records from Europe during the early modern period reveal how these changes unfolded. In earlier centuries, even well-off homes often contained a single main room where people worked, ate, and slept. By the 17th and 18th centuries, however, many houses began including separate sleeping chambers. These rooms contained beds that remained in place permanently, rather than being assembled from temporary bedding each evening. Curtains, blankets, and mattresses were added to improve warmth and comfort. The bed itself became a central feature of the room rather than one option among many sleeping surfaces. Similar developments appeared in other parts of the world as urban populations expanded and homes became more structured. The growing importance of private space also influenced how sleep was organized. In earlier centuries, it was common for several family members to share the same sleeping area. With the development of bedrooms, individuals or couples increasingly occupied separate sleeping spaces. This shift reflected changing ideas about privacy, household organization, and personal comfort. The sleeping environment became more individualized than it had been for most of human history. Instead of resting together on shared mats or bedding spread across the floor, people began associating sleep with a specific place that belonged to them. The spread of mattresses also played a role in this transformation. Early mattresses were often filled with straw, wool, or other natural materials placed inside cloth coverings. Over time, these designs improved, providing thicker and softer surfaces than earlier bedding layers. When placed on wooden frames, mattresses created a sleeping surface noticeably different from the firm ground that had supported humans for thousands of generations. These developments did not occur instantly or everywhere at once. In rural regions and among poorer households, floor sleeping and simple bedding remained common for much longer. Yet across many societies, the general pattern was clear. Sleep gradually moved away from the ground and into a dedicated piece of furniture located within a specific room of the home. For the first time in human history, the place of sleep became fixed not only by the bed itself, but also by the architecture of the house that contained it. As beds became more common in households, the experience of sleep slowly changed in ways that earlier generations had never known. For thousands of years, people had treated sleep as something flexible. Bedding could appear and disappear within the same space, and several members of a household often rested close together. But once beds began to occupy fixed positions inside dedicated bedrooms, the structure of nighttime life became more stable and predictable. The bed was no longer an object that could be moved easily or replaced each evening with simple materials. It became a permanent part of the home, shaping how rooms were arranged and how individuals experienced rest. The growing availability of furniture played an important role in this transformation. Improvements in woodworking and textile production made it easier to construct bed frames and produce bedding materials. Mattresses gradually became thicker and more layered than earlier forms of bedding. In many regions, they were filled with materials such as straw, wool, cotton, or feathers. These fillings created a softer surface than the woven mats or thin bedding that had supported human sleep for centuries. When placed on a wooden frame, the mattress created a clear separation between the body and the ground beneath the house. This separation marked a quiet shift in the physical environment of sleep. Instead of adapting the body to the firmness of the earth, people increasingly adapted their surroundings to support the body with constructed materials. The bedroom itself also developed new meanings within the home. Earlier houses often contained a single space used for many daily activities. With the spread of dedicated sleeping rooms, nighttime became associated with privacy and personal space. A bedroom could belong to a particular individual, a couple, or a small part of the household rather than to everyone at once. This arrangement encouraged the idea that sleep was a more personal experience, separate from the shared life of the household. Over time, social expectations around rest began to change as well. Families organized their homes so that the bed remained in a quiet room where activity gradually slowed after sunset. Lighting inside these rooms was reduced, and the environment became more controlled than the open camps or shared spaces of earlier human history. Windows, doors, and walls shielded sleepers from weather, wind, and much of the outside noise that had once been part of the natural night environment. This new setting created a form of sleep that was more isolated from the surrounding world than ever before. Despite these changes, the spread of beds was still uneven across different regions and social groups. In many rural communities, floor sleeping or simple bedding remained common well into recent centuries. Houses in such places were often small, and families continued to rely on flexible sleeping arrangements that allowed rooms to serve many purposes. Even where beds existed, they might be shared by several people, reflecting older traditions of communal rest. The transition from ground-based sleep to widespread use of beds therefore unfolded gradually rather than suddenly. Over several centuries, however, a broad shift became visible. As homes grew larger and furniture became more accessible, the bed slowly moved from being a luxury object to an ordinary part of everyday life. The bedroom emerged as a dedicated space for rest, and the mattress replaced the ground as the surface most people encountered each night. In this quiet way, the environment surrounding human sleep changed more dramatically during the last few hundred years than it had during most of the long history that came before. As beds and bedrooms became common in many parts of the world, The relationship between the human body and sleep entered a new stage in its long history. For thousands of generations, sleep had taken place in environments shaped mostly by nature. The ground, the temperature of the air, the presence of others nearby, and the fading light of evening all influenced how the body moved into rest. But with the rise of bedrooms and permanent beds, much of this natural context gradually disappeared. The sleeping environment became something humans controlled more carefully. Walls shielded the room from wind and weather. Doors separated the sleeper from the sounds of the surrounding household. Mattresses softened the surface beneath the body, replacing the firm ground that had supported human sleep for most of our evolutionary past. This transformation changed the rhythm of nighttime in subtle ways. In earlier periods, people often experienced the evening as a gradual transition from activity to rest. Conversations near the hearth faded slowly as the fire dimmed. Individuals lay down near one another on the ground, surrounded by the quiet movements of the group. In contrast, the bedroom created a more defined boundary between waking life and sleep. Entering the room and lying down on a bed signaled that the day had ended and rest had begun. The bed itself became a physical marker, separating the activities of the day from the stillness of the night. The mattress also introduced a different physical experience for the body. Instead of distributing weight across a firm surface, the sleeper now rested on layers designed to compress under pressure. Materials such as wool, cotton, or feathers created softer surfaces that shaped themselves around the body. Over time, mattress designs became more complex, incorporating springs, foam, and other materials intended to increase comfort. These developments made the bed feel very different from the ground-based sleeping surfaces that had supported humans for millennia. For many people, this softness became closely associated with the idea of good sleep. Cultural ideas about rest evolved alongside these physical changes. In societies where bedrooms and beds became standard, sleep gradually became more private and individualized. Children might have their own beds. Adults often slept separately from the rest of the household. The quiet space of the bedroom encouraged a sense that sleep was a personal activity rather than a communal one. This expectation of privacy would have seemed unfamiliar to many earlier human communities, where sleep occurred within shared spaces and the presence of others was part of the normal nighttime environment. Despite these changes, it is important to remember how recent this transformation has been in the long timeline of human history. The widespread use of beds and private bedrooms developed primarily within the last few centuries. Compared with the hundreds of thousands of years during which humans slept on the ground or on simple bedding, this period represents only a small fraction of our past. For most of the time that our species has existed, the body rested close to the earth, surrounded by others, and guided by the natural rhythms of night. The modern bedroom, therefore, marks a relatively new chapter in the story of human sleep. It reflects changes in architecture, technology, and cultural ideas about comfort and privacy. Yet beneath these modern surroundings, the human body still carries the long memory of a much older world where sleep began each night on the ground itself. When we look across the full history of our species, the modern bed begins to appear in a very different light. Today it often feels like an essential part of human life. Bedrooms are built around it. Entire industries exist to design mattresses, pillows, and frames intended to improve the quality of sleep. Yet when the timeline of human history stretches back hundreds of thousands of years, the presence of a bed occupies only a very small portion of that story. For the overwhelming majority of our past, humans rested directly on the ground or on simple layers of natural materials placed above it. The body fell asleep close to the earth, surrounded by the sounds of the environment and the presence of others nearby. This long history leaves subtle traces in how the human body and mind still approach rest today. Even though modern beds provide softness and elevation, the body often continues to move throughout the night, shifting positions in ways that resemble the adjustments made on firmer ground. Sleep remains a dynamic process rather than a completely motionless state. Muscles relax, pressure redistributes across different parts of the body, and the sleeper turns gradually from side to side. These patterns reflect a biological system shaped across generations when the ground itself was the primary sleeping surface. In many parts of the world, traditions that resemble these older forms of sleep still exist. People rest on woven mats, padded textiles, or thin mattresses placed directly on the floor, In some cultures, these arrangements are chosen deliberately because they offer flexibility within the home. Bedding can be folded and stored during the day, allowing living spaces to serve multiple purposes. Such practices demonstrate that the human body remains capable of resting comfortably in environments much closer to those of earlier human history. The modern bed is therefore not a universal requirement for sleep, but one possible solution among many. Understanding this long perspective can change the way we think about comfort and rest. The human body did not evolve with thick mattresses or elaborate bed frames. It adapted over countless generations to sleep in conditions shaped by the natural world: firm ground, shifting temperatures, shared spaces, and the gradual transition from evening activity to night. Beds introduce new levels of softness and separation from the earth, yet the biological processes that guide sleep remain deeply rooted in that earlier history. Recognizing this does not mean that modern beds are unnecessary or harmful. They represent one stage in the ongoing relationship between humans and their environment. Throughout history, people have continually adjusted their surroundings to improve rest, whether by spreading grasses on the ground, weaving mats, or building wooden frames. Each of these solutions reflects the same basic human goal: creating a place where the body can relax and recover from the day. When viewed through this wider lens, the story of the bed becomes less about invention and more about adaptation. Human sleep has always evolved alongside the environments where people live. The ground, the mat, the raised frame, and the mattress are all part of that long process. Yet beneath every one of these changes remains a simple truth that connects us to our distant ancestors: the need to lie down, close our eyes, and allow the body to return to rest as night slowly unfolds. When the long history of human sleep is considered carefully, a quiet pattern begins to emerge. For most of the time our species has existed, the place of rest was shaped directly by the surrounding world rather than by constructed furniture. The earth itself formed the base of sleep, softened by leaves, grasses, animal skins, or woven mats. Firelight, the presence of family members nearby, and the gradual cooling of the night air all contributed to the environment in which the body settled into rest. These conditions were not temporary exceptions. They represented the normal experience of sleep for hundreds of thousands of years. Only in the most recent chapters of human history did the bed become a central object in the sleeping environment. When beds spread more widely and bedrooms became common features of houses, the physical surroundings of sleep changed significantly. The body was lifted above the ground, resting on surfaces designed to compress and soften under weight. Walls and doors separated the sleeper from many of the natural signals that once shaped nighttime awareness. Artificial lighting allowed people to remain awake long after sunset, shifting the rhythm that had once followed the movement of darkness across the sky. These changes created a sleeping environment very different from the one in which human sleep originally evolved. Yet the biological foundations of sleep remain largely the same. The brain still moves through cycles of rest that regulate memory, repair tissues, and restore the balance of the nervous system. The body still shifts position throughout the night, redistributing pressure and relaxing muscles. These patterns developed long before mattresses, bed frames, or bedrooms existed. They belong to a much older relationship between the human body and the natural world. In some ways, modern sleeping environments attempt to recreate aspects of that earlier relationship. Mattresses are designed to support the curves of the body. Blankets and coverings regulate warmth in ways similar to how plant layers or animal skins once helped conserve heat. Even the quiet darkness of a bedroom echoes the gradual fading of light that once signaled the approach of night in open landscapes. Technology has changed the materials involved, but the goal remains similar: creating conditions that allow the body to rest deeply and safely. Looking back across this history invites a different way of thinking about the bed itself. Instead of seeing it as a timeless necessity, it can be understood as one step in a long chain of human adaptations. For thousands of generations, sleep occurred without beds, yet the human body rested successfully within those environments. The ground, softened by natural materials and shared with others nearby, supported the nightly restoration that every human needs. Beds later added new forms of comfort and privacy, but they did not create the biological need for sleep. That need has always existed independently of furniture. In this sense, the modern bed is part of a much larger story about how humans shape their surroundings in response to the needs of the body. Each generation inherits the patterns of rest formed by those who lived before. Beneath the layers of mattresses, blankets, and wooden frames, the human body still carries the quiet memory of a far older world where sleep arrived on the ground beneath the open sky. As the story of human sleep reaches the present day, the bed now appears almost everywhere. In many homes around the world, it stands quietly at the center of the bedroom, waiting for the moment when the day ends and the body becomes tired. Sheets are arranged, pillows are placed carefully, and the mattress offers a soft surface that supports the weight of the sleeper. It feels natural, almost inevitable, that sleep should happen this way. Yet when the full history of our species is remembered, the bed reveals itself as a relatively recent chapter in a much older story. For hundreds of thousands of years before beds existed, the human body rested directly on the earth or on simple layers of natural materials. Night arrived beneath open skies, beside fading firelight, and within the quiet presence of others nearby. The ground was not a symbol of hardship. It was simply where sleep happened. Over time, humans gradually reshaped the environment around them. Leaves became bedding, branches formed simple platforms, houses created stable indoor floors, and eventually wooden frames lifted sleepers above the earth. Mattresses softened the surface further, and bedrooms separated rest from the activity of daily life. Each of these changes represents an attempt to create a more controlled and comfortable place for the body to recover during the night. Yet beneath all of these layers of innovation, the basic nature of sleep remains unchanged. The body still closes its eyes, the breathing slows, and the mind passes through cycles that repair and restore the systems of life. In that quiet process, the modern sleeper shares something deeply familiar with ancestors who lived tens of thousands of years ago. They too lay down at the end of the day, allowing fatigue to fade as the night unfolded around them. The difference was only the surface beneath their bodies and the structures that surrounded them. Recognizing this long history can invite a gentler perspective on how humans relate to sleep today. The bed is not the origin of rest, but one adaptation among many. Across time, humans have always shaped their sleeping places using the materials and knowledge available to them. Some rested on grasses beneath open skies. Others slept on woven mats inside simple homes. Later generations built wooden frames and soft mattresses. Each of these environments supported the same fundamental need for recovery and stillness. When night arrives and the body grows quiet, the distance between past and present becomes smaller than it first appears. The modern bed stands as a symbol of comfort and technological progress, yet the human body resting upon it still carries the memory of a far older world. It remembers the rhythm of darkness, the warmth of nearby bodies, and the steady ground beneath it. And perhaps this raises a final question that lingers gently in the mind as sleep approaches. If the human body spent most of its history resting close to the earth, what part of that ancient relationship with the ground still lives quietly within us tonight?